When desperate single father Marcus crashed a luxury wedding with his hungry daughter just to feed her, he never expected the bride walking down the aisle to be Elenatha, a woman whose heart he shattered 10 years ago and never stopped loving. Before we dive into this incredible story, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story too. The fluorescent lights of Riverside Elementary School cast their harsh, institutional glow across the empty hallways as Marcus Thompson pushed his janitorial cart down the main corridor. The wheels squeaked slightly. He'd been meaning to oil them for weeks, but somehow there was always something more pressing that needed his attention. It was 10:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in October, and the building hummed with the quiet energy of a place settling into rest after a day filled with the chaotic joy of 400 children. Marcus moved with practiced efficiency, his 6'2" frame navigating the familiar route he'd walked every weeknight for the past 3 years. At 34, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that seemed almost out of place in his navy blue uniform, his movements economical and purposeful. His dark eyes, sharp with intelligence, swept the hallway with the systematic attention of someone who understood systems and problems, a skill that had once earned him a full scholarship to MIT and now helped him ensure that Emma's school remained clean and functional. In his breast pocket, folded carefully, was a crayon drawing Emma had made that afternoon while waiting for him to finish his shift. It depicted the two of them holding hands under a rainbow, with "My Daddy is the Best" written in her careful 7-year-old cursive. He touched the paper gently as he worked, a reminder of why the ache in his lower back and the chemical smell on his hands were small prices to pay for the stability this job provided. The memory of how he'd ended up here still felt surreal, like a particularly vivid nightmare that refused to fade upon waking. Just 4 years ago, Dr. Marcus Thompson had been the co-founder of Innovate Tech Solutions, a promising startup developing next-generation water purification systems for developing countries. His MIT engineering PhD had opened doors that seemed to lead straight to a future of impact and success. He'd had a house in Cambridge, a workshop filled with prototypes, and a wife who smiled at him across their dinner table while discussing their plans for the company and their growing family. The company had failed spectacularly. Not through any fault of the technology. Marcus's innovations were solid, even brilliant, but through a combination of investor betrayal, a business partner who proved more interested in quick profits than long-term impact, and a series of legal battles that drained their resources faster than their revolutionary filtration systems could clean contaminated water. When the dust settled, Marcus found himself not only bankrupt but facing allegations of patent theft from his former partner, accusations that were eventually dismissed, but not before they destroyed his reputation in the close-knit engineering community. Sarah, his wife, had tried to weather the storm initially, but as their house went into foreclosure and the legal bills mounted, her patience wore thin. The final blow came when she filed for divorce, claiming that Marcus's obsession with unworkable ideals had destroyed their family's security. The custody battle that followed was brutal and expensive, eating up what little remained of his savings. In the end, a judge had awarded him every other weekend with Emma and Wednesday evening dinner-supervised visits that felt like carefully measured doses of his own daughter's love. That arrangement lasted exactly 6 months before Sarah moved to Seattle with her new boyfriend, a software engineer with steady employment and a house in the suburbs. She'd left Emma with Marcus, claiming the constant travel between coasts wasn't fair to a young child. Marcus suspected the truth was simpler: single motherhood didn't fit with Sarah's new life plan. The abandonment had been devastating for Emma, but Marcus had buried his own pain to focus entirely on helping his daughter adjust to a world where her mother sent birthday cards but never called. Now, as he cleaned whiteboards and emptied trash cans, Marcus tried not to think about the work he'd once done, designing systems that could provide clean water to entire villages, solving complex engineering problems that could improve thousands of lives. Instead, he focused on smaller victories, making sure Emma's classroom was spotless each morning, ensuring the playground equipment was safe, fixing broken projectors and computers with skills that far exceeded what the school district expected from their night janitor. "Mr. Thompson?" a voice called from down the hallway. Marcus turned to see Mrs. Patterson, the fourth-grade teacher, emerging from her classroom with an armload of papers. She was one of the few faculty members who consistently acknowledged his presence with more than a polite nod. "Working late again?" he asked, checking his watch. Most teachers cleared out by 6 p.m., eager to escape to their own families and responsibilities. "Parent conferences next week," she sighed, adjusting her glasses. "I swear these progress reports multiply when I'm not looking." She paused, studying him with the same analytical attention she probably applied to her students' work. "You know, I've been meaning to ask. Emma mentioned you help her with her math homework. Are you familiar with the new Common Core methods?" Marcus nodded, careful to keep his expression neutral. "I pick things up pretty quickly. Emma explains how her teacher wants things done, and I just follow along." What he didn't mention was that he'd spent 2 hours the previous weekend analyzing Emma's math curriculum, identifying inefficiencies in the teaching progression, and developing simplified explanations that helped her grasp concepts weeks before they were formally introduced in class. He'd also noticed that 3 of the story problems in her textbook contained mathematical errors. But correcting a textbook felt beyond the purview of a janitor, even one with a PhD in engineering. "Well, whatever you're doing, it's working," Mrs. Patterson said with genuine warmth. "Emma's math scores have improved dramatically this quarter. She's actually helping other students now." Pride swelled in Marcus's chest, followed immediately by the familiar ache of limitation. In another life, he might have been designing curriculum, consulting with educators, or developing learning technologies. In this life, he was grateful that his daughter's teacher took the time to acknowledge his existence at all. After Mrs. Patterson left, Marcus continued his rounds, his thoughts drifting to the parent-teacher conferences she'd mentioned. He'd requested time off to attend Emma's conference, something that had required submitting a formal request to his supervisor, Bob Martinez, who seemed perpetually annoyed by any deviation from standard procedures. "Thompson, you know these conference things are during work hours," Bob had grumbled when Marcus submitted the paperwork. "The school pays you to clean at night, not to play parent during the day." Marcus had bit back his immediate response that the school paid him to ensure their facility remained functional, and that his playing parent was actually his primary responsibility in life. Instead, he'd simply said, "I'll make up the hours on the weekend if needed." The truth was, Bob's attitude reflected the broader perception of Marcus throughout the school community. To most people, he was simply the janitor, invisible unless something needed fixing, easily replaced, and certainly not someone whose opinions or insights might have value. Parents barely glanced at him when they passed in the hallways during pickup, except occasionally to ensure their children weren't bothering him. The message was clear. He existed to serve their needs, not to participate in their community. This social invisibility was particularly acute during school events. Marcus had attended Emma's spring concert the previous year, sitting in the back row in his cleanest shirt and tie, watching his daughter sing with fierce concentration as she tried to remember all the words to "This Land Is Your Land." Afterward, as families gathered for punch and cookies, he'd found himself standing alone near the refreshment table, while other parents clustered in animated conversations about vacation plans and their children's achievements. "Excuse me," a woman had said, approaching him with an expression of polite authority. "Could you help us move these tables back to the cafeteria? We're trying to clear the space." She'd assumed he was working the event, not attending as a parent. Marcus had quietly helped move the tables, then slipped out without correcting her misunderstanding. Emma had asked later why he'd left early, and he'd invented an excuse about needing to get back to work. The isolation wasn't limited to parents. Some of the younger teachers treated him with the casual disregard reserved for service workers, speaking around him as if he weren't present or issuing requests without the basic courtesy of please and thank you. He'd overheard conversations about budget cuts to custodial services, discussions about whether the school really needed a full-time night janitor, debates about outsourcing cleaning to a contract company that would cost less and require less engagement from the administration. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was the extent to which Marcus had quietly improved their workplace. The computer network that had been chronically slow now operated at optimal speed thanks to his after-hours troubleshooting and system optimization. The heating system that had been inefficient and expensive now ran on a schedule he'd reprogrammed, saving the district thousands in utility costs. The security cameras that had been poorly positioned and frequently malfunctioned now provided comprehensive coverage with minimal blind spots. He'd rewired the electrical system in the art room to eliminate the power surges that had been destroying expensive equipment. He'd redesigned the lunch line flow to reduce wait times and minimize congestion. He'd even submitted anonymous suggestions to the principal about playground safety improvements, presenting them as observations from his maintenance walks rather than the systematic engineering analysis they actually represented. Marcus told himself he did these things for Emma, to ensure her school remained a place where she could thrive and feel proud. But if he was honest, he also did them because solving problems was in his nature, because his mind couldn't help but see inefficiencies and envision improvements, because the work kept his engineering skills sharp, even if no one recognized or valued them. The most painful aspect of his situation wasn't the work itself. Marcus had always believed in the dignity of honest labor, regardless of its nature. The pain came from watching Emma navigate the social implications of having a janitor for a father, seeing her 7-year-old mind struggle to understand why other children sometimes made comments about his job, why some parents spoke to him differently than they spoke to each other. Last month, Emma had come home from school, unusually quiet, picking at her dinner of mac and cheese and apple slices with uncharacteristic disinterest. "How was school today, sweetheart?" Marcus had asked, settling into the chair across from her at their small kitchen table. "Fine," she'd answered, the word carrying the weight of unexpressed emotion. "Just fine? What about the science project you were excited about this morning?" Emma had looked up at him with her mother's green eyes, the feature that most clearly marked her as Sarah's daughter, and asked, "Daddy, why is Aiden's mom a doctor and his dad a lawyer? But you're just a janitor?" The question had hit Marcus like a physical blow, not because of any shame about his work, but because of what it revealed about the messages Emma was receiving from her peers. He'd taken a careful breath, choosing his words with the precision he'd once applied to engineering specifications. "There's no just about any honest work, Em," he'd said gently. "I take care of your school so it's clean and safe for you and all your friends. That's important work." "But Aiden said janitors are for people who aren't smart enough to do real jobs," Emma had pressed, her young voice carrying confusion rather than accusation. Marcus had felt something hot and protective rise in his chest, but he'd kept his voice calm. "What do you think, Em? Do you think I'm not smart enough for a real job?" "You're the smartest person I know," Emma had declared with the fierce loyalty of childhood. "You help me with homework and you fix everything, and you know about stars and planets and why flowers grow." "Then maybe Aiden doesn't know what he's talking about," Marcus had suggested with a smile. "Sometimes people say things that aren't true because they don't understand. Your job isn't to convince them, it's to know what's true for yourself." That conversation had ended with Emma satisfied, but Marcus had lain awake that night, wondering how many more such encounters his daughter would face. He'd considered the possibility of finding other work, something that might carry more social prestige, but the practical realities were stark. He had a criminal background check issue from the patent litigation that made many employers nervous. His PhD was impressive on paper but difficult to explain in job interviews when followed by 3 years of janitorial work. And most importantly, this job's night shift allowed him to be available for Emma during the day, to pick her up from school and help with homework, and be present for the countless small moments that comprise childhood. As Marcus finished mopping the main hallway and prepared to tackle the classrooms, his phone buzzed with a text message. Emma's face smiled up at him from the lock screen, a photo taken last weekend at the park, where they'd spent the afternoon feeding ducks and playing on the swings. Daddy, Mrs. Chen said we're having career day next week and parents can come talk about their jobs. Can you come? I want to tell everyone about how you take care of our whole school. Marcus stared at the message for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. Career Day? An event designed to showcase successful professionals, to inspire children to dream big and work hard toward impressive futures. He imagined standing in front of Emma's class in his uniform, trying to make janitorial work sound exciting to a room full of 7-year-olds whose parents included doctors, lawyers, engineers, and business executives. More painful was the image of Emma's face if he declined, the disappointment she'd try to hide, the questions she'd ask later about why Daddy couldn't come when everyone else's parents would be there. He typed back, "Of course I'll come, sweetheart. I'd love to tell your class about my work." The lie felt necessary. He wouldn't love it, would likely find it excruciating, but he would endure it because Emma needed him to show up, needed to know that her father considered her important enough to face his own discomfort. As Marcus locked up the building and walked to his 10-year-old Honda Civic, he reflected on the strange mathematics of his current life. On paper, he had lost almost everything that society taught him to value: career success, financial stability, social status, even his marriage. But in the small apartment he shared with Emma, in the quiet moments when she fell asleep reading on his shoulder, in the proud smile she gave him each morning when he dropped her off at school, he had found something he'd never quite possessed in his previous life. The drive home took him through neighborhoods that showcased the economic geography of their small city. He passed the gated community where some of Emma's classmates lived, houses with circular driveways and 3-car garages, then through the middle-class area where most of the teachers resided, modest but well-maintained homes with swing sets in the backyards. Finally, he reached his own neighborhood, not dangerous, but definitely struggling, where apartments like theirs represented the best available option for people working full-time jobs that still left them economically vulnerable. Their building was a brown brick structure built in the 1970s, showing its age but managed by a landlord who kept it reasonably maintained. Marcus parked in his assigned spot and climbed the external stairs to their second-floor unit, fishing for his keys while mentally reviewing Emma's schedule for the following day. She had piano practice after school, a $30 monthly expense that required creative budgeting but filled their apartment with music and Emma with joy. Inside, Mrs. Rodriguez from next door was dozing on their couch, the television murmuring quietly in the background. She'd been watching Emma during Marcus's work hours for the past year, refusing to accept more than $20 a week for childcare that would have cost him 3 times as much through a formal service. Her own grandchildren lived across the country, and she claimed that Emma's presence kept her from being lonely, but Marcus knew he was receiving charity disguised as friendship. "How was she tonight?" he asked quietly, not wanting to wake Emma if she was already asleep. "Perfect. As always, Mrs. Rodriguez whispered back, gathering her knitting. "She did her homework. We made grilled cheese for dinner, and she spent an hour drawing pictures of you at work. That child adores you, Marcus." "I'm the lucky one," Marcus replied, meaning it completely. After Mrs. Rodriguez left, Marcus checked on Emma, finding her fast asleep with a book about space exploration splayed across her chest. He carefully marked her place and set the book on her nightstand, then kissed her forehead gently. She stirred slightly, murmuring, "Love you, Daddy," in her sleep, words that made his chest tight with emotion. In his own room, Marcus sat at the small desk wedged between his dresser and the window, opening his laptop to review the online engineering courses he'd been taking in his spare time. Not because he harbored illusions about returning to his former career, but because keeping his skills current felt like maintaining a connection to the person he'd once been. Tonight's module covered advanced water filtration systems technology remarkably similar to what he'd been developing when his world collapsed. As he worked through complex calculations and system designs, Marcus allowed himself a moment of bitter irony. Tomorrow, he would empty trash cans and scrub floors, invisible to the very people whose children benefited from his hidden improvements to their school. But tonight, in the quiet of his modest apartment, while his daughter slept safely nearby, he solved problems that could improve thousands of lives, his mind as sharp and capable as it had ever been. The dichotomy no longer surprised him, though it still sometimes stung. He had learned to find purpose in small victories. Emma's math scores, her confident laughter, the way she introduced him to her friends without hesitation or embarrassment. These achievements might not impress the parents who looked through him during school events, but they represented everything that truly mattered. Outside his window, the city settled into late-night quiet, and Marcus Thompson Yanitor, single father, invisible man with an extraordinary mind prepared for another day of being overlooked by everyone except the one person whose opinion actually counted. Tomorrow, he would push his squeaky cart down familiar hallways, and Emma would beam at him from her classroom doorway, and that would be enough. It had to be enough. For now, it was everything. The soft hum of Emma's colored pencils moving across paper provided a gentle soundtrack as Marcus worked at the computer terminal in the school's main office. It was 11:30 p.m. on a Thursday, and his daughter sat cross-legged on the floor nearby. Her homework spread around her like a small academic ecosystem. She'd insisted on staying late tonight, claiming she needed to finish a science report about electrical circuits, a topic that had led to an impromptu lesson from Marcus about conductivity and resistance that far exceeded her second-grade curriculum. "Daddy, why are you typing so fast?" Emma asked, looking up from her drawing of a light bulb connected to a battery. "It sounds like rain on the windows." Marcus paused in his coding, glancing down at his daughter with a smile. "I'm fixing the computer system that helps your teachers take attendance and send messages to parents. It's been running slowly, making everyone wait longer than they need to." What he didn't tell her was that he'd identified 17 critical vulnerabilities in the school district's network security, optimized database queries that had been causing system-wide slowdowns, and implemented an automated backup protocol that would prevent the kind of data loss that had plagued the district the previous semester. The work required skills he'd developed during his MIT years and refined through his startup experience capabilities that far exceeded anything the school district's IT contractor had demonstrated. Emma nodded seriously, as if 7-year-olds regularly discussed network optimization with their parents. "Will it help Mrs. Chen send the pictures from our field trip to the zoo faster?" "Much faster," Marcus confirmed, returning to his keyboard. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was voluntarily performing complex system administration that the district paid an outside company $75,000 annually to handle inadequately. But watching Emma's face light up when her teacher could seamlessly share classroom photos with parents made every unpaid hour worthwhile. This had become their routine over the past year. 3 nights a week, Emma would accompany him to work, transforming his janitorial duties into a father-daughter adventure. She'd set up her mobile homework station in whatever area he was working, chattering about her day while he cleaned, organized, and increasingly solved problems that had nothing to do with his official job description. Marcus had initially worried about bringing Emma to work, concerned that it might interfere with his responsibilities or create liability issues. But his supervisor, Bob Martinez, was rarely around during the night shift, and the building's after-hours silence seemed to bring out Emma's most focused academic energy. Some of her best work happened in the quiet classrooms, where Marcus mopped floors, and she puzzled through math problems, their parallel dedication creating an atmosphere of shared purpose. Tonight's computer work represented just the latest in a series of unofficial improvements Marcus had implemented throughout Riverside Elementary. It had started small tightening loose screws on desks, replacing burned-out bulbs with more efficient LED alternatives, adjusting door hinges that had been squeaking for months. But as he'd observed the school's operations more closely, his engineering mind had begun identifying systemic inefficiencies that went far beyond basic maintenance. The heating and cooling system had been his first major project. After Emma complained about her classroom being too cold in winter and stifling in spring, Marcus had spent several nights analyzing the building's HVAC operations. What he'd discovered was a poorly calibrated system that was simultaneously wasting energy and failing to maintain comfortable temperatures. The thermostats were outdated, the ductwork had several blockages, and the scheduling protocols were designed for a building with different usage patterns. Over the course of 2 weeks, working in careful increments to avoid detection, Marcus had recalibrated the entire system. He'd cleaned the ductwork, reprogrammed the thermostats with more sophisticated algorithms, and implemented zone-based heating and cooling that accounted for factors like classroom occupancy, solar exposure, and time of day. The result was a 30% reduction in energy costs and dramatically improved comfort throughout the building. "Emma, what do you think about the temperature in your classroom lately?" he'd asked casually a month after completing the work. "It's perfect," she'd replied enthusiastically. "Mrs. Chen said we don't have to wear our coats inside anymore, and Tommy stopped complaining about being too hot by the windows." The satisfaction Marcus felt from her answer exceeded anything he'd experienced during his startup days. This was immediate, tangible impact that directly improved his daughter's daily environment. The playground safety improvements had emerged from a different kind of parental concern. During a weekend visit to the school playground, Marcus had noticed several potential hazards: loose bolts on the climbing structure, inadequate fall protection under the swings, and sightline obstructions that created blind spots for supervising teachers. His engineering background had trained him to assess structural integrity and risk factors, skills that proved invaluable when applied to child safety. Rather than simply reporting these issues through official channels, a process that would likely take months and might result in equipment being declared off-limits rather than properly repaired, Marcus had addressed them systematically during his night shifts. He'd tightened and reinforced the climbing structure, installed additional rubber matting in high-impact areas, and strategically repositioned several pieces of equipment to improve supervision sightlines. The work had required him to purchase materials with his own limited funds, but watching Emma play confidently on equipment he'd made safer felt like the best investment he'd ever made. When the district's insurance inspector conducted the annual playground assessment, she'd noted the facility's exceptional maintenance and safety compliance, a commendation that earned praise for Bob Martinez, who accepted the recognition without mentioning Marcus's contributions. Emma had watched much of this work with fascination, her young mind absorbing lessons about problem-solving, attention to detail, and taking responsibility for community improvement. She'd helped by holding flashlights, organizing tools, and asking the kind of innocent questions that often led Marcus to explain complex concepts in simple terms. "Why do you check all the bolts twice, Daddy?" she'd asked during one late-night playground maintenance session. "Because other people's children play here?" Marcus had replied, testing the tension on a swing chain. "Their safety depends on this equipment working perfectly. Checking twice means being sure." Emma had nodded solemnly, understanding that her father's work carried weight beyond its official recognition. These conversations were shaping her understanding of responsibility, excellence, and service values that no curriculum could teach as effectively as lived example. The computer lab renovation had presented Marcus's most technically challenging project. The school's technology infrastructure was a patchwork of outdated equipment, incompatible software, and jury-rigged connections that barely functioned. Students were limited to simple word processing and basic internet research because the systems couldn't handle more sophisticated educational software. Marcus had spent weeks analyzing the lab's configuration, identifying bottlenecks and compatibility issues. The core problem wasn't the age of the equipment, though, that didn't help, but rather the lack of systematic integration and optimization. The network configuration was inefficient, the software installations were corrupted by years of patches and workarounds, and the physical setup created workflow problems that frustrated both teachers and students. Working exclusively during his night shifts, Marcus had essentially rebuilt the entire lab from the ground up. He'd reformatted and optimized every computer, implemented a clean network architecture, and installed educational software that he'd researched and obtained through academic licensing programs. The physical layout was reconfigured to improve collaboration and supervision, with cable management that eliminated trip hazards and created a more professional appearance. The transformation was dramatic. What had been a frustrating obstacle to digital learning became a model computer lab that enhanced every aspect of the school's technology education. Teachers who had previously avoided the lab began incorporating computer-based activities into their lesson plans. Students who had struggled with basic typing began developing genuine technological literacy. Emma had been present for much of this work, initially just doing homework nearby but gradually becoming more involved as Marcus explained what he was doing and why. "This computer keeps crashing because it's trying to run too many programs at once," he'd explained one night, showing her a task manager display. "It's like trying to carry too many books eventually, you drop them all." "So you teach it to carry fewer books at a time?" Emma had asked, her 7-year-old logic cutting straight to the heart of resource management. "Exactly. And we make sure the books it carries are the ones it actually needs." These impromptu technology lessons were giving Emma an advanced understanding of computer systems that would serve her well in a digital future. But more importantly, they were teaching her to see technology as something she could understand and control rather than a mysterious force beyond her comprehension. Principal Rodriguez had begun to notice the improvements, though she attributed them to various other sources. The energy savings had been credited to the district's sustainability initiative. The improved playground safety was seen as evidence of better maintenance protocols. The computer lab's transformation was explained as the result of the IT contractor's latest service visit. Marcus had carefully avoided taking credit for any of these improvements, understanding that his unofficial status made recognition potentially problematic. Janitors weren't supposed to reconfigure computer networks or redesign HVAC systems. The improvements had to appear to emerge from official channels to avoid questions about liability, authorization, and professional credentials. But Principal Rodriguez wasn't completely oblivious to the correlation between the building's improved operations and Marcus's presence. During a recent conversation about the school's reduced maintenance costs, she'd commented to Bob Martinez, "Whatever you and your team are doing, it's working. This building has never run so smoothly." Bob had accepted the praise with characteristic gruffness, but Marcus had noticed him watching more carefully during subsequent visits, as if trying to identify the source of the improvements he was receiving credit for. The most complex project Marcus had undertaken was the security system upgrade. The school's existing cameras were poorly positioned, frequently malfunctioned, and recorded footage of such poor quality that it was essentially useless for identifying individuals or incidents. For a building full of children, this represented a significant safety vulnerability. Using his knowledge of surveillance technology and risk assessment, Marcus had developed a comprehensive security improvement plan. He'd identified optimal camera positions, researched equipment that would integrate with existing systems, and designed a monitoring protocol that would provide real-time alerts for unusual activity. The challenge was implementing these improvements without exceeding his authority or creating obvious evidence of his involvement. Marcus had approached this systematically, making small adjustments to existing camera positions, cleaning and calibrating equipment to improve performance, and suggesting to Bob that certain areas might benefit from enhanced monitoring. "You know, Bob," he'd mentioned casually during one of their brief encounters, "I've noticed some blind spots near the main entrance during my evening rounds. Might be worth having the security company take a look." Bob had grunted noncommittally, but 2 weeks later, the security contractor had conducted an assessment that resulted in several of the improvements Marcus had identified. The contractor, impressed by the building's unusually thorough maintenance protocols, had recommended expanding their service contract, a suggestion that Bob had enthusiastically supported, taking credit for initiating the comprehensive security review. Emma had observed much of this work with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children bring to their parents' competence. To her, it seemed natural that Daddy could fix computers, improve playgrounds, and solve complex problems. She'd grown up watching him approach challenges systematically, break down complex issues into manageable components, and persist until he found effective solutions. "Why don't other janitors do the things you do?" she'd asked one evening, watching him optimize the library's lighting system to reduce glare on computer screens. Marcus had considered his answer carefully. Different people have different skills and different ways of helping. I happen to know about these kinds of problems, so I can help solve them. But shouldn't the school know you can do these things? Emma had pressed with characteristic directness. The question had cut to the heart of Marcus's complicated relationship with his hidden expertise. Part of him yearned for recognition, for acknowledgement of his contributions and capabilities. But a larger part understood that his unofficial status provided freedom to make improvements without bureaucratic interference, political complications, or expectations that might compromise his primary job security. Sometimes helping is more important than getting credit, he'd explained to Emma. What matters is that your school works better and everyone benefits, not whether people know who made it happen. Emma had accepted this philosophy with the trust children place in their parents' wisdom, but Marcus could see her young mind processing the implications. She was learning lessons about service, humility, and the complex relationship between recognition and impact, lessons that would shape her character in ways no formal education could match. The financial impact of Marcus's improvements was substantial, though largely invisible to the school's administration. His energy efficiency modifications were saving the district approximately $400 monthly in utility costs. The playground improvements had prevented several potential liability issues that could have cost thousands in legal fees or insurance claims. The computer lab renovation had eliminated the need for a 50-0 technology upgrade that had been scheduled for the following year. Most significantly, his proactive maintenance and system optimization had prevented numerous emergency repair situations that would have been both expensive and disruptive to the educational environment. By addressing problems before they became critical, Marcus was saving the district money while ensuring that learning could continue uninterrupted. But these financial benefits were accompanied by something more valuable: the creation of an environment where Emma and her classmates could thrive. Every improvement Marcus made was designed to enhance the educational experience, whether through better technology access, improved comfort, enhanced safety, or reduced distractions from malfunctioning equipment. As Marcus worked on the attendance system that Thursday night, Emma looked up from her science report with sudden curiosity. "Daddy, how do you know so much about computers and electricity and building things?" The question was innocent, but it carried weight that Marcus felt in his chest. How could he explain his MIT education, his former career, the complex path that had led from designing revolutionary water purification systems to optimizing elementary school networks? How could he convey the satisfaction he found in applying his expertise to improve his daughter's daily environment, even if that work went unrecognized and uncompensated? "I've always been curious about how things work," he said finally, saving his progress on the attendance system upgrade. "When you understand how systems operate, you can usually figure out how to make them work better." "Will you teach me?" Emma asked, her green eyes bright with interest. "I'm already teaching you," Marcus replied with a smile. "Every time you watch me work, every time you ask questions, every time you help me solve problems, that's learning. You're developing the same kind of thinking that helps me fix things." Emma beamed at this response, returning to her homework with renewed focus. She was already demonstrating the systematic thinking that Marcus had tried to cultivate, approaching her assignments with methodical care and creative problem-solving that impressed her teachers. As the night progressed, Marcus completed the attendance system optimization and moved on to addressing a ventilation issue in the art room that had been causing paint fumes to linger longer than safe. Emma packed up her homework and settled into a comfortable chair with a book about astronomy, content to read while her father worked. This quiet partnership had become the foundation of their relationship. Emma understood that Daddy's work was important and took pride in being part of it, even if she couldn't fully comprehend the technical complexity of his contributions. Marcus found purpose and satisfaction in creating a better environment for his daughter, while exercising the intellectual capabilities that had once defined his professional identity. Neither of them knew that Marcus's hidden genius was about to be revealed in the most unexpected way possible during a career day presentation that would force the school community to confront their assumptions about worth, capability, and the true meaning of heroism. For now, they were content in their shared purpose. improving the world one small, unrecognized improvement at a time. As Emma drifted off to sleep in her chair, still holding her astronomy book, Marcus finished calibrating the art room ventilation and began planning his next project. Upgrading the playground's drainage system before the spring rains created puddles that would limit outdoor recreation time. It was detailed, technical work that would benefit hundreds of children while remaining completely invisible to the adults who made decisions about funding, recognition, and respect. But in his daughter's peaceful breathing and the improved environment surrounding them, Marcus found all the validation he needed. Tomorrow, Emma would attend classes in a building that ran more efficiently, safely, and effectively because of his hidden contributions. That knowledge sustained him through the long night hours and the social invisibility that defined his days. The genius remained hidden, but its impact was everywhere. 10 years earlier, autumn rain drummed against the windows of the University of Washington's art building as Marcus Chen hunched over his design portfolio, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across sketches that had consumed the better part of his weekend. His fingers, stained with charcoal and ink, moved with practiced precision as he adjusted the typography on a concert poster design, his third revision of what his professor had called promising but lacking sophistication. The criticism stung because Marcus knew it was code for something deeper. His designs carried the aesthetic of someone who had learned Photoshop from YouTube tutorials and studied color theory from library books checked out on extended loan. Unlike his classmates, who casually mentioned summer internships at their father's advertising firms or design studios, Marcus had spent his breaks working construction with his uncle or pulling double shifts at the campus coffee shop to cover tuition that scholarships didn't touch. "Still here, Chen?" called Jake Morrison, one of his graphic design classmates, as he packed up his MacBook Pro, same model Marcus had been saving for since freshman year. "Some of us have lives outside this dungeon, you know." Marcus managed a tired smile. "Just trying to get this poster right. Professor Williams said the client presentation is make or break for our final grades." "Dude, it's Friday night. Williams isn't going to flunk anyone whose daddy donates to the alumni fund." Jake's tone was casual, but the implication hung in the air like cigarette smoke. "Besides, didn't you hear? There's a gallery opening downtown. Free wine, fancy cheese, the whole pretentious art scene thing. Perfect hunting ground." The invitation to join Jake's expedition held no appeal for Marcus. Art gallery openings meant conversations about aesthetic movements he'd studied but never experienced firsthand, wine that cost more per bottle than his weekly grocery budget, and people who would politely ask what his parents did for a living before finding reasons to excuse themselves from the conversation. "Thanks, but I'll pass," Marcus replied, returning his attention to the poster. "This project needs another few hours." Jake shrugged, clearly accustomed to Marcus's hermit tendencies. "Your loss. Elena Rodriguez will be there, and I heard she just broke up with that pre-law dickhead she was dating." The name made Marcus's hand pause over his sketchpad. Elena Rodriguez had haunted the periphery of his college experience, like a beautiful ghost present in classes they shared, visible across crowded lecture halls, occasionally appearing in his sight line at the library where she studied with the focused intensity that made professors light up when she raised her hand. She was everything Marcus had learned not to want. Effortlessly elegant, frighteningly intelligent, and surrounded by the kind of casual wealth that made designer clothes look like afterthoughts. Her father owned a chain of upscale restaurants throughout the Pacific Northwest, and her mother sat on the boards of several prominent arts organizations. Elena moved through the university like someone born to belong in its ivy-covered buildings and tradition-steeped halls. "Elena Rodriguez," Marcus repeated, pretending the name didn't send a jolt of electricity through his nervous system. "The event planning major who aced Professor Kim's impossible marketing strategy course." "That's the one. Word is, she's looking to branch out from her usual social circle." Jake's grin was predatory in the way of 20-year-old men who thought charm and persistence could overcome any obstacle. "I figure tonight's my chance to make an impression." After Jake left, Marcus tried to refocus on his design work, but Elena's name had lodged itself in his mind like a splinter. He'd been peripherally aware of her for 2 years, admiring from afar the way she presented her ideas with quiet confidence, how she asked questions that revealed depths of understanding that made their professors pause and reconsider their own assumptions. During their shared marketing seminar the previous semester, Marcus had watched her deconstruct a major corporation's rebranding campaign with surgical precision, identifying flaws that the executives responsible had missed entirely. Her critique was brilliant, compassionate, and delivered without a trace of the arrogance that characterized most student presentations. He'd wanted to approach her afterward to tell her how insightful her analysis had been, but she'd been immediately surrounded by classmates and admirers, all eager to bask in her intellectual radiance. Marcus had convinced himself that someone like Elena Rodriguez wouldn't have time for a scholarship kid from Tacoma, whose most sophisticated cultural experience had been the traveling Broadway shows his mother had occasionally splurged on for his birthday. As the evening deepened and the art building emptied, Marcus found himself staring at the same design elements without really seeing them. The poster had become a meditation on inadequate color choice. Every font selection, every compositional decision felt like evidence of his outsider status in a world that valued pedigree as much as talent. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Working late again? Remember to eat something. Love you." The message was a gentle reminder of the distance he'd traveled from his childhood home, where his parents, a nurse and a mechanic, had worked overtime for years to help fund his education. They'd sacrificed vacations, delayed home repairs, and eaten countless dinners of rice and whatever protein was on sale that week to give him opportunities they'd never had. The weight of their investment pressed against his shoulders as he stared at his portfolio. Success felt both urgently necessary and impossibly distant, a mountain peak visible through clouds but separated by terrain he wasn't sure he knew how to navigate. By midnight, Marcus finally admitted defeat and began packing up his supplies. The poster would have to suffice, even if it lacked the sophistication that seemed to come naturally to his more privileged classmates. As he switched off the studio lights, the building settled into silence, broken only by the distant sound of Friday night revelry from nearby fraternity houses. The rain had intensified during his hours of focused work, transforming the campus into an impressionist painting of blurred lights and reflected surfaces. Marcus pulled his jacket hood up and began the 20-minute walk to his off-campus apartment, a studio space he shared with 2 roommates in a building that had seen better decades. He was halfway across the quad when he noticed a figure huddled under the inadequate shelter of a decorative tree, arms wrapped around herself as rain dripped steadily from the sparse autumn leaves. Even in the dim light, something about her silhouette was familiar. As he drew closer, Marcus realized with a start that the stranded figure was Elena Rodriguez. She wore a dress that probably cost more than his monthly rent, but the expensive fabric provided little protection against Seattle's persistent drizzle. Her dark hair, usually perfectly styled, hung in damp tendrils around her shoulders. "Elena?" he called out, quickening his pace. She looked up, and even in the poor lighting, Marcus could see that she'd been crying. Her makeup, applied with obvious care earlier in the evening, had been compromised by rain and tears, creating watercolor smudges beneath her eyes. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying surprise and something that might have been relief. "What are you doing out here?" "I could ask you the same thing," he replied, noting that she was shivering despite her attempts to hide it. "Shouldn't you be at that gallery opening?" Elena's laugh held no humor. "I was." It turned out to be exactly as pretentious and suffocating as expected. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her mascara further. "My ride abandoned me for someone with better connections, and the buses stopped running an hour ago." Marcus didn't hesitate. "Come on," he said, offering her his arm. "My apartment isn't far. You can dry off and I'll call you a cab." For a moment, Elena looked as though she might refuse pride and self-reliance warring with practical necessity. Then, another gust of wind sent rain sideways across the quad, and she accepted his arm with grateful dignity. They walked in comfortable silence through the storm, Marcus's jacket large enough to provide some shelter for both of them. Up close, he caught the faint scent of her perfume, something subtle and expensive that made him acutely aware of his own less sophisticated cologne. "I'm sorry about your evening," Marcus said as they climbed the stairs to his apartment building. "Gallery openings can be pretty brutal if you're not in the mood for small talk and network schmoozing." "You speak from experience?" Elena asked, and Marcus caught the genuine curiosity in her voice. "Not really," he admitted, fishing for his keys. "But I've learned to recognize the symptoms of social exhaustion. Plus, Jake Morrison has been describing his hunting strategies in excruciating detail." Elena's expression shifted to something between amusement and distaste. "Jake Morrison. I should have known. He spent 20 minutes explaining why Jackson Pollock was overrated while standing directly in front of a Pollock piece. It was like watching someone dig their own intellectual grave." Marcus laughed, surprised by her directness. "That sounds like Jake. He's convinced that contrarian opinions make him seem sophisticated." His apartment was exactly what Elena might have expected from a scholarship student. Clean but sparse, furnished with items that prioritized function over form. The living room doubled as Marcus's studio space, with design projects taped to the walls and art supplies organized in repurposed containers. A small kitchen alcove contained the basics necessary for survival, and 2 bedroom doors suggested roommates who were either asleep or absent. "It's not much," Marcus said, suddenly embarrassed by the contrast between his living situation and what he imagined Elena's must be. "But it's warm and dry." "It's perfect," Elena replied, and her tone suggested she meant it. She gravitated immediately toward his design wall, studying the array of projects with the focused attention she brought to everything that interested her. "These are yours?" Marcus nodded, watching her examine his work with growing anxiety. Her opinion mattered in a way that his professor's grades never could, because Elena had no obligation to be encouraging or diplomatic. "This concert poster series is extraordinary," she said finally, pointing to a set of designs he'd created for local venues that couldn't afford professional marketing. "The way you've used typography as a visual element, it's like the words are dancing. And this logo design." She traced the air around a piece he'd created for a neighborhood coffee shop. "It captures something essential about community spaces. How do you do that?" The question was asked without condescension, genuine curiosity about his creative process. Marcus found himself explaining his approach, how he spent hours in the locations he was designing for, absorbing their atmospheres and studying the people who inhabited them. "Most designers start with aesthetics and work backward," he explained, warming to the subject. "But I think good design has to understand its context first. A poster for a punk show should feel different from one advertising a jazz quartet, not just in terms of fonts and colors, but in terms of energy and intention." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly what's missing from most of the marketing campaigns we study in class. They're technically proficient, but emotionally empty." As they talked, Marcus prepared tea in his small kitchen, acutely aware that he was offering Earl Grey from discount tea bags, while Elena probably had experience with exotic blends from boutique shops. But she accepted the mug gratefully, wrapping her hands around it for warmth. "Can I ask you something?" Elena said, settling onto his second-hand couch with her legs tucked beneath her. "Why do you always sit in the back of our shared classes? Your insights during discussions are always the most interesting, but you rarely volunteer them." The question caught Marcus off guard. He'd assumed his relative invisibility in academic settings was by choice, a defensive strategy to avoid drawing attention to himself. The idea that Elena had not only noticed his presence but valued his contributions was startling. "I guess I figure there are enough voices in those rooms already," he said carefully. "People who've been preparing their opinions since childhood, who know how to present ideas with the kind of confidence that comes from never doubting your right to be heard." Elena studied his face with an intensity that made him nervous. "And you don't feel like you have that right?" "Do I?" Marcus countered, setting down his tea mug. "My parents are first-generation college graduates, who still think my degree might be an elaborate scam because they can't understand how drawing pictures counts as a real major." I learned about art history from Wikipedia and marketing theory from textbooks I bought used and highlighted until they fell apart. Half the references people make in class go completely over my head. But that's exactly why your voice matters, Elena insisted, leaning forward with passionate conviction. Everyone else in those rooms has been trained to think the same way, to value the same things, to see the world through the same privileged lens. You bring a perspective that's actually connected to how most people live. Her vehemence surprised him. Elena Rodriguez, who moved through their shared academic spaces with such apparent confidence, was advocating for the value of his outsider status as though she understood something about being on the margins herself. "What about you?" Marcus asked. "You always seem so comfortable in academic settings, so sure of your place." Elena's smile was rueful. Being comfortable and belonging aren't the same thing. Yes, I have advantages: my parents' money, their connections, my familiarity with cultural references and social codes, but I also know that most people see those advantages first and me second. They assume I'm in college as a finishing school experience before I marry someone suitable and become a decorative accessory to his more important career. The bitterness in her voice revealed depths Marcus hadn't suspected. He'd categorized Elena as someone for whom success came easily, who navigated social and academic challenges with inherited confidence. The possibility that she felt as displaced and misunderstood as he did was revelatory. "Is that what your family expects?" he asked gently. "More or less," Elena replied, staring into her tea mug. "They support my education because it looks good and provides opportunities to meet the right sort of people. But they've made it clear that my degree should be considered secondary to finding an appropriate husband and producing appropriate grandchildren. The event planning major is acceptable because it's feminine enough to be non-threatening while still requiring some organizational skill." Marcus found himself anger on her behalf. Anger at people who would reduce someone as brilliant and capable as Elena to a decorative role in someone else's story. "That's insane," he said. "You're one of the smartest people I've ever encountered. You see connections and possibilities that other people miss entirely. Anyone who treats that as secondary to your potential as a wife is an idiot." Elena looked up at him with surprise, as though genuine recognition of her intellectual abilities was rare enough to be startling. "Thank you," she said softly. "You have no idea how much I needed to hear that tonight." They talked until dawn. Conversations ranging from academic theory to personal dreams to the particular challenges of feeling like outsiders in a world that claimed to value diversity while maintaining deeply entrenched hierarchies. Marcus learned that Elena's apparent confidence masked the same imposter syndrome he battled daily, that her privileged background came with expectations and limitations he'd never considered. Elena discovered that Marcus's quiet intensity in classes reflected not disengagement, but the careful observation of someone who'd learned to listen before speaking. His designs weren't technically sophisticated because he'd learned graphic arts from online tutorials and secondhand textbooks, but they possessed an emotional authenticity that formal training often destroyed. As morning light began filtering through his small windows, Elena's phone buzzed with increasingly frantic messages from friends who'd assumed she'd found her own way home from the gallery opening. The intrusion of the outside world felt jarring after hours of intimate conversation. "I should go," Elena said reluctantly, checking the time. "My roommate will be organizing search parties soon." Marcus called a cab, insisting on paying despite Elena's protests. As they waited for the driver, an awkward uncertainty settled between them. The evening had created an intimacy that felt both profound and fragile. A connection neither had expected but both were reluctant to break. "Would you like to have coffee sometime?" Marcus asked, as the taxi pulled up outside his building. "I mean, real coffee, not the disaster I served you tonight." Elena's smile was radiant. "I would love that, but I'm buying. I know a place that serves the kind of coffee that actually tastes like coffee, instead of disappointment." Their first official date took place 3 days later, at a small cafe near campus that Elena had discovered during one of her explorations of neighborhoods her usual social circle avoided. The conversation picked up exactly where their late-night discussion had ended, as though no time had passed. Marcus arrived early, nervous energy making it impossible to sit still as he waited. When Elena appeared in the doorway, scanning the cafe for his familiar face, he felt his heart perform an elaborate gymnastics routine. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail that somehow made her more beautiful than her gallery-opening elegance. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Marcus admitted, as she settled into the chair across from him. "Why wouldn't I?" Elena asked, genuinely puzzled. "Because Friday night might have been a fluke," he replied honestly. "People sometimes connect during moments of crisis or vulnerability, but when normal life resumes, those connections don't always survive daylight." Elena reached across the small table to touch his hand briefly. "Friday night wasn't a fluke, Marcus. It was the first time in months that I felt like someone was actually listening to me instead of waiting for their turn to talk." What followed was 3 months of the kind of romance that college students write poetry about and adults remember with bittersweet nostalgia. They discovered Seattle together, Elena introducing Marcus to museums and cultural events he'd never felt entitled to attend, while he showed her neighborhoods and communities that existed beyond her privileged bubble. Their academic collaboration proved as seamless as their personal connection. Elena's strategic thinking complemented Marcus's creative instincts, resulting in projects that caught their professors' attention and earned them opportunities for joint presentations and research projects. "You make me want to be braver," Elena told him one evening as they walked through Pike Place Market, sharing samples and watching vendors perform for tourists. "More honest about what I actually want instead of what I'm supposed to want." "What do you want?" Marcus asked, though part of him feared the answer might include elements he couldn't provide. Elena stopped walking, turning to face him with an expression of such sincere affection that Marcus felt his defenses crumble entirely. "I want to build something meaningful with someone who sees me as a complete person. I want to wake up excited about the work I'm doing and the life I'm creating. I want to feel useful and necessary and challenged." She paused, then added with characteristic directness, "I want those things with you." Spring semester brought new challenges and opportunities. Elena's parents, who had initially dismissed Marcus as a temporary distraction, began expressing concern about their daughter's increasingly serious relationship with someone outside their social circle. Elena reported these conversations with growing frustration, her family's expectations creating tension she'd never experienced before. "They want to meet you," she announced one April afternoon as they studied together in the library. "Dinner at their house this weekend." Mother made it sound like a casual invitation, but I know it's actually an interrogation disguised as hospitality. Marcus felt his stomach clench with familiar anxiety. "Do you think that's a good idea?" "I think it's inevitable," Elena replied pragmatically. "Either I introduce you to them on my terms, or they'll find ways to investigate you on theirs. At least this way, I can control the environment somewhat." The Rodriguez family home was exactly what Marcus had expected, a sprawling craftsman-style house in an exclusive neighborhood, with gardens that required professional maintenance and interior design that had been featured in local magazines. Elena's father, Roberto, was a distinguished man in his 50s, whose success in the restaurant industry had been built on a combination of business acumen and carefully cultivated charm. Elena's mother, Carmen, possessed the kind of elegance that came from generations of careful breeding and social training. She served dinner on china that had been in the family for decades while asking questions that seemed casual but were clearly designed to establish Marcus's background and prospects. "Elena tells us you're studying graphic design," Carmen said as they began the main course. "That must be creative work. Do you have internships lined up for this summer?" Marcus explained his part-time job situation and his hope of finding more substantial design work after graduation. He could see Elena's parents exchanging glances as he described his need to work multiple jobs to support his education. "And your family?" Roberto asked. "What line of work are they in?" The question Marcus had been dreading. "My father is a mechanic and my mother is a nurse. They've been incredibly supportive of my education." How wonderful. Carmen said, with the tone people use when they want to appear gracious, while making clear that they consider the subject closed. Healthcare and automotive repair are certainly essential services. The condescension was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks as he recognized the careful way Elena's parents were cataloging his inadequacies while maintaining a veneer of politeness. Elena attempted to redirect the conversation toward Marcus's academic achievements and design portfolio, but her parents' attention had clearly shifted to assessment mode. They asked probing questions about his post-graduation plans, his financial prospects, and his long-term goals that felt more like a job interview than a social dinner. "Marcus has been accepted to several graduate programs," Elena interjected when her father questioned the viability of a design career, "including some with full funding." "Graduate school," Roberto mused. "That's several more years of education before entering the workforce. Quite an investment of time and money." The implication was clear. Marcus was a luxury Elena couldn't afford, a romantic indulgence that would delay her entry into the appropriate social and economic circles her family had spent decades positioning her to join. After dinner, as Elena walked Marcus to his car, she was uncharacteristically quiet. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "They weren't as welcoming as I'd hoped." "They were fine," Marcus lied, not wanting to create additional conflict between Elena and her family. "They're just protective of you." "They're snobs," Elena said bluntly. "They've decided you're unsuitable without bothering to understand who you actually are or what you're capable of becoming." The conversation haunted Marcus for weeks. He began noticing details about Elena's lifestyle that he'd previously overlooked. The casual way she bought textbooks without checking prices, her assumption that graduate school was a choice rather than a financial impossibility, her plans for post-graduation travel that required resources he couldn't imagine possessing. Their relationship continued, but Marcus found himself increasingly aware of the practical obstacles their different backgrounds created. When Elena suggested they look for apartments together for senior year, Marcus had to explain that his budget limited him to shared spaces in less desirable neighborhoods. When she proposed spring break trips or weekend getaways, he made excuses rather than admit he couldn't afford such luxuries. The breaking point came in late May, just weeks before their graduation. Elena burst into Marcus's apartment with excitement radiating from every molecule of her being. "I have incredible news," she announced, practically bouncing as she spoke. "My father met with his business partners yesterday, and they're interested in investing in a marketing and design firm. Specifically, a firm that would combine my event planning and strategic marketing background with your creative abilities." Marcus stared at her, processing the implications of what she was suggesting. "A firm that we would run together?" "Exactly." Elena's enthusiasm was infectious, her eyes bright with visions of their shared future. "They're talking about substantial startup capital, enough to lease proper office space and hire additional staff. We could build something amazing, Marcus. Something that's entirely ours." The offer was everything Marcus had dreamed of, and everything he'd feared. Financial security, professional opportunity, the chance to work alongside the woman he loved more than he'd thought possible. It was also charity disguised as investment, a way for Elena's family to control their relationship while appearing generous. "What would be expected in return?" Marcus asked carefully. Elena's excitement dimmed slightly as she registered his tone. "What do you mean?" "I mean, your father doesn't strike me as someone who makes business investments based purely on sentiment," Marcus replied. "What strings are attached to this generous offer?" "There are no strings," Elena insisted, but uncertainty had crept into her voice. "They believe in our potential as business partners." "Do they? Or do they see this as a way to keep their daughter occupied with a suitable project while ensuring her unsuitable boyfriend remains financially dependent on their goodwill?" The words hung between them like a challenge neither wanted to acknowledge. Elena's face flushed with anger and hurt, while Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied conversations about class and money. "You're being paranoid," Elena said, though her voice lacked conviction. "This is an opportunity, not a conspiracy." "Is it?" Marcus asked. "What happens if we break up?" What happens if your parents decide I'm not grateful enough for their largesse? What happens when they want to expand the business in directions I disagree with, but their money gives them the final say? Elena stared at him with growing comprehension and dismay. You're going to turn this down? I'm going to turn this down, Marcus confirmed, hating himself even as he spoke the words that would destroy everything between them. Why? Elena's voice was barely above a whisper. Why would you choose pride over our future together? Because it's not our future, Marcus replied, each word cutting him as deeply as it cut her. It's your future, funded by your family's money, with me as a supporting character who can be written out if I become inconvenient. Tears began streaming down Elena's face, and Marcus felt his resolve waver. Every instinct screamed at him to take back his words, to accept the offer and worry about the consequences later. But he knew that accepting would mean spending the rest of his life wondering whether his success was earned or purchased, whether Elena loved him or simply felt obligated to the project her family had invested in. I love you, Elena said, her voice breaking on the words. I love you, and I want to build a life with you. Why isn't that enough? Because love isn't enough, Marcus replied, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. Not when everything else is stacked against us. Your family will never accept me as an equal, and I can't spend my life proving that I deserve what they see as charity. Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her expression shifting from heartbreak to something harder and more final. You're a coward, she said quietly. You're so afraid of being seen as less than that. You're willing to throw away something beautiful and real. Maybe I am, Marcus admitted, but at least I'm an honest coward. Elena left his apartment that night and never returned. They saw each other at graduation, moving through the ceremony with careful distance and studied indifference. Elena's family surrounded her with congratulations and celebration, while Marcus sat with his parents, who were too proud and excited to notice his emotional devastation. The job offer was quietly withdrawn, replaced by what Elena's father probably considered a consolation prize, a recommendation letter that helped Marcus secure a position at a small design firm in Portland. It was honest work that paid enough to cover basic expenses, but it was also a kind of exile from the life he might have built with Elena. Within weeks of graduation, Elena was gone, having accepted a position with a prestigious event planning company in San Francisco. Marcus learned about her departure through mutual friends, the same way he learned about her subsequent promotions, her successful launches of her own company, and, eventually, her engagement to a man whose background made him an appropriate match for Roberto and Carmen Rodriguez's daughter. For 10 years, Marcus carried the weight of that choice. During sleepless nights, when Lily was teething or sick, during the long hours at his multiple jobs when other people's success felt like personal failure, during the quiet moments when he allowed himself to wonder what might have been if he'd been brave enough to trust in love over pride. He'd convinced himself that he'd made the right choice, that accepting Elena's family's offer would have destroyed his self-respect and eventually their relationship. But seeing her radiant in her wedding dress, surrounded by the life she'd built without him, Marcus finally understood the full cost of his decision. He'd chosen pride over love, independence over partnership, the illusion of control over the messy reality of compromise. And Elena had moved on, exactly as she should have, building the meaningful life she'd dreamed of with someone who hadn't been too afraid to accept what she offered. The rain that had brought them together that night 10 years ago seemed like a different lifetime, a moment of possibility that Marcus had been too young and too proud to recognize as the gift it was. Now, watching Elena navigate her wedding reception with grace and joy, he understood that some choices can't be undone, some words can't be taken back, and some loves, once lost, remain lost forever. The morning after graduation, Marcus Chen sat in his studio apartment, surrounded by cardboard boxes and the detritus of 4 years at the University of Washington. His diploma lay on the kitchen counter beside his acceptance letter to the Portland design firm, a consolation prize that felt more like exile than opportunity. Every item he packed carried memories of Elena. The concert poster series she'd praised, the marketing textbooks they'd studied together, the coffee mug from their first official date. His phone buzzed with congratulations texts from classmates, most of whom were celebrating job offers at prestigious Seattle firms or graduate school acceptances that promised to delay real-world responsibilities for another few years. Marcus deleted most messages without responding, unable to summon enthusiasm for a future that felt like settling for scraps. The knock on his door came just as he was debating whether to keep the framed photo of him and Elena from last New Year's Eve, her smile radiant as confetti fell around them, his arm wrapped protectively around her waist, as though he could hold on to that moment forever. "It's open," he called, expecting one of his roommates returning for forgotten belongings. Instead, Roberto Rodriguez entered, looking distinctly out of place in the modest apartment with his expensive suit and practiced businessman's smile. He carried a briefcase that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly rent and surveyed the sparse living space with barely concealed distaste. "Mr. Chen," Roberto said formally, as though they were meeting for the first time rather than acknowledging the dinner where he'd catalogued Marcus's inadequacies with surgical precision. "I hope I'm not interrupting your packing." Marcus rose slowly, wariness prickling along his spine. "Mr. Rodriguez, I wasn't expecting you." "I imagine not." Roberto settled himself on the second-hand couch without invitation, opening his briefcase with businesslike efficiency. "I wanted to discuss your future plans before you leave Seattle permanently." The phrasing made it clear that Marcus's departure was not only expected but desired. "I have a position lined up in Portland," Marcus replied carefully. "The recommendation letter you provided was very helpful." "Yes, the Morrison Agency. Adequate work for someone of your background." Roberto's tone suggested he considered adequacy the height of what Marcus might reasonably achieve. "However, I'm prepared to offer an alternative that might better serve everyone's interests." From his briefcase, Roberto withdrew a folder containing what appeared to be legal documents. "I've spoken with my partners about establishing a scholarship fund for promising students from disadvantaged backgrounds. The fund would provide full tuition for graduate school, plus a living stipend, in exchange for a commitment to work with underserved communities upon completion." Marcus stared at the documents, recognizing the elegant trap being constructed around him. "That's very generous." "The program would be perfect for someone like you," Roberto continued smoothly. "Graduate school would provide the credentials and connections necessary for meaningful career advancement. The living stipend would eliminate financial stress, and the community service requirement would ensure the investment serves a worthy cause." "And Elena?" Roberto's smile never wavered, but something calculating flickered in his eyes. "My daughter will be focusing on her own career development in San Francisco. I'm sure you understand that long-distance relationships rarely survive the pressures of professional growth." The offer was brilliant in its cruel-tivory thing Marcus needed to succeed, contingent on accepting that Elena was not part of his future. Roberto had identified Marcus's greatest weakness and crafted a solution that addressed his pride while ensuring his permanent removal from Elena's life. "How long would this program last?" Marcus asked, though he already suspected the answer. 3 years for the degree, plus a 5-year commitment to approved community organizations. 8 years total. Roberto's tone suggested this was a reasonable time frame for Marcus to build a suitable life while Elena established herself with someone more appropriate. Marcus looked around his apartment one final time, imagining what 8 years of separation would mean. Elena would move on, marry someone from her own social circle, build the life her parents envisioned for her. Meanwhile, he would be safely contained in graduate school and community service, his potential for disruption neutralized. "Thank you for the offer," Marcus said finally, "but I'll stick with the Portland position." Roberto's composure faltered slightly. "Mr. Chen, I don't think you understand the magnitude of what I'm offering. This represents a significant investment in your future." "I understand perfectly," Marcus replied. "You're offering to fund my exile in exchange for your daughter's freedom to make more suitable choices." The answer is no. "You're making a mistake," Roberto said, closing his briefcase with sharp efficiency. "Pride is a luxury you can't afford." After Roberto left, Marcus finished packing in silence, each folded shirt and packed book feeling like preparation for a long journey with no certain destination. He left Seattle the next morning, driving south on I-5 with everything he owned crammed into his aging Honda Civic and Elvis Costello playing on repeat because the melancholy perfectly matched his mood. Portland offered exactly what he'd expected. Honest work at modest pay. Colleagues who appreciated his talent without demanding explanations for his background. And the blessed anonymity of a city where no one knew about his failed love story. The Morrison Agency specialized in small business marketing and community organization campaigns work that felt meaningful even if it didn't pay particularly well. For the first year, Marcus threw himself into projects with the desperate energy of someone trying to outrun his own thoughts. He designed logos for local restaurants, created marketing materials for nonprofit organizations, and slowly built a reputation as someone who understood how to communicate with working-class audiences because he was one of them. His small apartment in the Hawthorne district became a sanctuary of careful simplicity second-hand furniture arranged with an eye for both function and aesthetics, walls decorated with his own design work and prints from local artists he couldn't quite afford but bought anyway, because beauty seemed necessary for psychological survival. The first time he searched for Elena online, 6 months after graduation, Marcus told himself it was simple curiosity about how her San Francisco position was developing. Her LinkedIn profile showed rapid advancement at Wellington Events, one of the city's most prestigious planning firms. The photo showed her in professional attire, smiling with confident enthusiasm as she stood beside what appeared to be a corporate gala setup. "She looks happy," Marcus murmured to his empty apartment, though the observation felt like swallowing glass. By year 2, Elena had launched her own company, Rodriguez Events, Marketing, specializing in luxury weddings and corporate celebrations. Her website featured testimonials from clients praising her innovative vision and flawless execution. Marcus found himself studying the photos of her work with professional interest that gradually shifted into something more personal and painful. Her aesthetic had evolved, incorporating elements they'd discussed during their late-night conversations about design philosophy. He could see traces of their shared ideas in her color palettes and spatial arrangements, as though she'd taken the best parts of their intellectual collaboration and transformed them into something entirely her own. "Good for her," Marcus said aloud, closing his laptop with more force than necessary. Year 3 brought Marcus his first major professional breakthrough, a contract to redesign the branding for a regional hospital system. The project combined his technical skills with his understanding of community needs, resulting in materials that made healthcare information accessible to populations that traditional marketing often ignored. The success led to additional healthcare projects, and Marcus began to see the possibility of building something meaningful from his chosen exile. He hired a part-time assistant, moved to a larger apartment, and allowed himself to imagine a future where Portland felt like home rather than penance. But late at night, when the city grew quiet and his laptop screen cast blue light across his living room, Marcus still found himself checking Elena's social media presence with the compulsive regularity of someone monitoring a chronic injury. Elena's company had exploded in popularity, her client list reading like a directory of West Coast wealth and influence. Magazine features praised her innovative approach to event design, her ability to create experiences that felt both luxurious and personal. She'd been named to several 30 under 30 lists and served on the boards of local arts organizations. In interviews, Elena spoke passionately about using events to build community connections, about the importance of creating meaningful celebrations that reflected clients' authentic values rather than simply displaying their economic status. Marcus recognized the idealism they'd shared in college, refined by experience, but still fundamentally driven by the desire to create something beautiful and purposeful. Year 4 brought an unexpected complication. Sarah Mitchell, a freelance photographer who worked with several of Marcus's nonprofit clients. She was funny, talented, and possessed the kind of straightforward ambition that Marcus found refreshing after his complicated history with Elena's more complex motivations. "You're overthinking this," Sarah said one evening as they shared dinner at a Southeast Portland restaurant known for its commitment to local ingredients and reasonable prices. I like you, you like me, we both understand what it means to work for something instead of inheriting it. Why does it have to be more complicated than that?" Marcus smiled, appreciating both her directness and her implicit understanding of his background. Sarah's parents were teachers who'd supported her photography career through encouragement rather than financial backing. She understood the peculiar pride that came with success earned rather than given. Their relationship developed with comfortable predictability, shared interests, compatible work schedules, and the easy intimacy of two people who approached life with similar priorities. Sarah never pushed for details about Marcus's past relationships, content with his explanation that he'd left someone behind in Seattle who belonged to a different world. For 18 months, Marcus convinced himself that contentment was sufficient substitute for the consuming passion he'd experienced with Elena. Sarah was everything a rational person should want in a partner. Kind, intelligent, supportive of his career, undemanding about commitment timelines. Their relationship felt healthy in ways his connection with Elena never had. The engagement happened naturally, almost inevitably, during a weekend trip to the Oregon coast. Sarah had been photographing tide pools, while Marcus sketched ideas for a community center logo, both of them comfortable in the silence that long partnership had made possible. "I think we should get married," Sarah said matter-of-factly as they packed up their supplies. "Not because we're desperate or running out of time, but because we work well together and we both want the same things." Marcus looked at her hair windblown from the coastal breeze, camera slung around her neck, expression open and hopeful, and felt the kind of warm affection that seemed like it should be enough. "I think you're right," he replied, surprised by how easily the words came. They were planning a small ceremony at a Portland venue known for supporting local artists when Sarah found Marcus's laptop open to Elena's website at 2 a.m, 3 weeks before their wedding date. "Who is she?" Sarah asked quietly from the bedroom doorway, her voice carrying the weight of suspicions finally confirmed. Marcus closed the laptop slowly, knowing that honesty would end everything but unable to construct a lie that would preserve what they'd built together. "Someone I knew in college. Someone I loved very much and lost because I was too proud to accept help from her family." Sarah sat on the edge of their bed, studying his face with the careful attention she usually reserved for framing difficult photographs. "And you still love her?" It wasn't a question. Marcus nodded, feeling simultaneously relieved and devastated by the admission. "I wanted to move on," he said helplessly. "I thought I had moved on. You deserve someone who isn't carrying around the ghost of someone else's life." Sarah was quiet for a long time, processing this information with characteristic thoughtfulness. Finally, she smiled sadly. "I know you care about me, Marcus. I also know I've been competing with a memory for 2 years, and memories have an unfair advantage because they never disappoint you in small daily ways." They ended their engagement with the same mature consideration that had characterized their entire relationship. Sarah kept the apartment they'd shared, while Marcus moved to a smaller place in southeast Portland and threw himself back into work with renewed desperation. Year 6 brought the first mention of Elena's personal life in the society pages. Engagement to Richard Thornton, heir to a San Francisco real estate fortune, and exactly the kind of appropriate match Roberto Rodriguez had always envisioned for his daughter. Marcus stared at the engagement announcement photo for 20 minutes, studying Elena's smile for signs of the radiant joy he remembered from their college days. She looked beautiful, elegant, professionally styled in a way that spoke of successful careers and comfortable futures. But something in her eyes seemed muted, as though she was performing happiness rather than experiencing it. Richard Thornton appeared beside her with the confident smile of someone who'd never doubted his right to possess beautiful things. His bio mentioned Harvard Business School, family connections in politics and philanthropy, and a shared commitment to civic engagement. He was everything Elena's parents could have wanted: appropriate, accomplished, and absolutely safe. "Good for her," Marcus said to his empty apartment, but the words tasted like sawdust. Year 7 brought Marcus's biggest professional opportunity, a chance to establish his own design consultancy focused on healthcare and community organization branding. The risk was enormous. leaving the steady paycheck at Morrison Agency for the uncertain income of independent contracting. But the potential rewards included both creative freedom and financial advancement that might finally allow him to stop living paycheck to paycheck. The decision was complicated by an unexpected factor. Melissa, a graphic designer at a nearby coffee shop who'd been flirting with Marcus for months. She was 8 years younger, energetic in ways that both charmed and exhausted him, and utterly uncomplicated in her approach to relationships. "You think too much?" she told him one evening as they shared drinks at a bar known for supporting local musicians. "Sometimes the right choice is the one that feels good instead of the one that makes sense on paper." Their relationship developed with the intensity of someone trying to prove something to himself. Melissa's enthusiasm for life was infectious, her assumption that love should be fun rather than torturous. A revelation after years of carrying the weight of complicated emotions. She knew nothing about Elena beyond Marcus's vague reference to someone from college who didn't work out, and her lack of curiosity about his past felt liberating. When Melissa became pregnant 6 months into their relationship, Marcus felt the universe shifting around him in ways both terrifying and oddly satisfying. Finally, something that demanded his complete attention and commitment, something that would anchor him to the present instead of allowing him to drift between memories and possibilities. "Are you happy?" Melissa asked, as they sat in the clinic examining room, staring at the ultrasound image that showed their daughter to be in grainy black and white. "I'm terrified," Marcus admitted. "But yes, I think I'm happy." Lily Chen was born on a rainy February morning, arriving 3 weeks early with the impatient energy that would characterize her entire personality. Marcus held his daughter for the first time with hands that shook from exhaustion and overwhelming love, her tiny fingers wrapping around his thumb with surprising strength. "She's perfect," he whispered, studying her impossibly small features and feeling his heart reorganize itself around this new reality. Melissa proved to be a devoted but restless mother, struggling with the transition from independent artist to primary caregiver. She loved Lily fiercely, but found the relentless demands of infant care stifling in ways she hadn't anticipated. "I feel like I'm disappearing," she confided to Marcus one evening as they took turns walking the colicky baby around their small apartment. "Like everything I was before is being erased by dirty diapers and feeding schedules." Marcus understood her frustration while feeling helpless to address it. His consulting business was struggling to gain traction, requiring long hours and networking events that kept him away from home precisely when Melissa needed the most support. They were both exhausted, both overwhelmed, both discovering that love for their child didn't automatically translate into compatibility as parents. The end came gradually, then suddenly. Melissa began staying out later, claiming she needed space to remember who she was outside of motherhood. Marcus would return from client meetings to find Lily with their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, while Melissa pursued photography projects that seemed to require increasingly frequent overnight trips. "I can't do this anymore," Melissa announced one morning when Lily was 18 months old. "I love her, but I'm not built for this kind of life. I need to be more than just someone's mother." The conversation that followed was painful but not surprising. Melissa wanted shared custody but acknowledged that her photography career required travel and irregular schedules that made consistent childcare impossible. Marcus found himself agreeing to primary custody while wondering how he would manage single parenthood and a struggling business simultaneously. "I'll send money when I can," Melissa promised as she packed her art supplies and camera equipment, "and I'll visit whenever I'm in Portland." She kept neither promise consistently. The financial support came sporadically, usually accompanied by apologetic texts about delayed payments from clients or unexpected travel expenses. The visits became increasingly rare, eventually settling into a pattern of birthday and Christmas appearances that left Lily confused and Marcus resentful. Years 8 and 9 blurred together in a haze of daycare pickups, client deadlines, and the grinding exhaustion of trying to build a business while raising a child alone. Marcus's consulting work focused increasingly on small nonprofit organizations that paid slowly but appreciated his understanding of their limited resources and community-focused missions. Some evenings, after Lily was asleep and the apartment was finally quiet, Marcus would allow himself to imagine alternative histories. What if he'd accepted Roberto's scholarship offer and spent 8 years building credentials and connections? What if he'd swallowed his pride and accepted Elena's family's business proposal? What if he'd been brave enough to trust that love could overcome the practical obstacles their different backgrounds created? But these fantasies always ended the same way. With Lily's absence, a reality so devastating that Marcus couldn't sustain the alternate timeline for more than a few minutes. His daughter had become the organizing principle of his existence, the reason he worked impossible hours and accepted projects that barely covered expenses. Every sacrifice was justified by her bright smile and growing personality. Year 10 brought the news Marcus had been dreading without quite realizing it. Elena's wedding announcement in the San Francisco Chronicle. The photo showed her radiant, in an engagement that had stretched nearly 3 years, finally culminating in what the society pages described as the wedding of the season. Marcus studied the image with the careful attention of an archaeologist examining artifacts from a lost civilization. Elena looked sophisticated, successful, and appropriately happy beside her equally polished fiancé. But even in the formal engagement photo, something in her expression seemed reserved, as though she was holding part of herself back from the performance of perfect happiness. "She's getting married," Marcus said aloud to his empty living room, the words confirming what he'd always known would happen eventually. The next morning, as he helped Lily get ready for school and packed her lunch with careful attention to nutrition and variety, Marcus felt the final weight of his choices settling around him. Elena was moving forward with her life, marrying someone who could provide the security and social position her parents had always wanted for her. Meanwhile, Marcus was raising his daughter alone, struggling to build a business that barely sustained them, living in the margins of a world that Elena now commanded with confident grace. But watching Lily chatter excitedly about her school art project while carefully arranging her sandwich and apple in her lunchbox, Marcus felt something he'd almost forgotten: genuine contentment with the life he'd actually built rather than regret for the life he'd lost. His phone buzzed with a text from a potential client, a community health center that needed branding materials for a new prenatal care program. The project would pay enough to cover their rent for 2 months, and represented exactly the kind of meaningful work that had drawn him to design in the first place. "Daddy, can we go to the park after school?" Lily asked, looking up at him with eyes that held no knowledge of complicated adult emotions, only the simple expectation that her father would continue being the reliable center of her universe. "Absolutely," Marcus replied, kissing the top of her head and feeling grateful for the clarity that single parenthood had forced upon him. Elena Rodriguez was getting married in Seattle, moving forward with a life that no longer included space for the complications Marcus represented. And Marcus Chen was raising his daughter in Portland, building a small but meaningful business that served communities Elena would probably never encounter. Their paths had diverged permanently, shaped by choices made in pride and fear and the terrible mathematics of young love complicated by different worlds. But both of them had found ways to create purpose from the wreckage of their shared dreams, even if that purpose looked nothing like what they'd once imagined together. That evening, after Lily was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Marcus closed his laptop without checking Elena's social media presence for the first time in 3 years. Some chapters, he realized, ended not with dramatic confrontations, but with the quiet recognition that the story had already moved beyond the need for resolution. Elena Rodriguez Thornton stood frozen beside the cocktail table where Marcus and Lily sat, her bouquet trembling slightly in her manicured hands as 10 years of carefully constructed composure threatened to crumble. The chandeliers cast warm light across the reception, but she felt as though she were standing in a spotlight that exposed every buried emotion she'd spent a decade learning to suppress. "Elena, sweetheart, there you are." Richard's voice cut through her shocked paralysis as her new husband approached with his characteristic confidence, champagne flute in hand and his Harvard Business School smile firmly in place. Senator Mitchell is asking about the honeymoon plans, and Mother wants to introduce you to the Ashford sap. Apparently they're considering hiring us for their daughter's engagement party." Richard's words washed over Elena without penetrating her consciousness. Every neuron in her brain was focused on Marcus Chen, who sat mere feet away looking like he wanted the marble floor to open and swallow him whole. He was thinner than she remembered, his face carrying the kind of exhaustion that spoke of years spent working too hard for too little. But his eyes, those dark, intelligent eyes that had once seen straight through to her soul, were exactly as she remembered. "Richard," she managed, her voice sounding distant even to her own ears, "I'd like you to meet Marcus Chen. We were classmates at the University of Washington." The introduction felt like swallowing broken glass. Classmates. As though Marcus had been someone she'd shared lecture halls with, rather than dreams. As though their late-night conversations about building something meaningful together could be reduced to the casual acquaintance of shared academic spaces. Richard extended his hand with the practiced charm that had made him successful in both business and politics. "Marcus, any friend of Elena's from her college days is welcome here. What brings you to Seattle? Are you in event planning as well?" Marcus rose slowly, accepting Richard's handshake with visible reluctance. "Graphic design," he replied tersely. "I'm based in Portland now." "Portland?" Richard's enthusiasm was genuine, untainted by any understanding of the emotional minefield he was traversing. "Fantastic city. We've been considering expanding there, so much creative energy, and the food scene is absolutely booming. You must give me some recommendations for authentic local experiences." Elena watched Marcus's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. The phrase, "authentic local experiences," probably sounded like the kind of calculated cultural tourism that Marcus had always found distasteful wealthy people consuming working-class neighborhoods as entertainment before returning to their own privileged bubbles. "I'm sure you'd find what you're looking for," Marcus replied with careful neutrality. "Daddy," Lily whispered, tugging at Marcus's sleeve with growing urgency. "Can we go now? I'm finished eating." Elena's attention shifted to the little girl, and she felt her heart perform a complicated gymnastics routine. Lily was perhaps 8 years old, with silky black hair and features that combined Asian and what appeared to be European heritage. She was beautiful in the unconscious way of children who hadn't yet learned to doubt their place in the world, but Elena could see the careful way she held herself, as though she'd learned not to take up too much space. "Of course, sweetheart," Marcus said quickly, clearly grateful for the excuse to escape. "Thank you for your hospitality," he added to Elena, his tone politely distant. "Congratulations on your marriage." The formality of his words hit Elena like a slap. After everything they'd shared, after the intimacy and understanding that had once felt as natural as breathing, Marcus was treating her like a polite stranger. She watched him help Lily gather her small purse, probably containing coloring books or games, to keep her occupied during adult events she'd been dragged toned, felt panic rising in her chest. "Wait," Elena said, her voice carrying more desperation than she'd intended. "I mean, there's no need to rush off. The evening is just getting started." Marcus paused, his hand on Lily's shoulder, and Elena saw something flicker across his expression: pain, longing, and what might have been anger, all compressed into a moment of unguarded emotion before his careful control reasserted itself. "We should really be going," he said quietly. "It's past Lily's bedtime, and we have a long drive back to Portland tomorrow." "Back to Portland?" Richard interjected, clearly confused by the tension he could sense but not understand. "Surely you're staying for the weekend? Seattle has so much to offer, and Elena knows all the best spots." Elena felt hysteria bubbling up in her throat. Her new husband was enthusiastically encouraging her ex-lover to extend his stay, completely oblivious to the fact that Marcus's presence was threatening to unravel everything she'd spent 10 years building. "We can't afford a hotel," Lily said, with the innocent directness of children who haven't yet learned that financial limitations are sources of shame. "Daddy says we're on a very tight budget this month." The silence that followed was deafening. Elena saw Richard's expression shift as he processed this information, his practiced social grace struggling to accommodate the reality of financial hardship in his carefully curated world. She saw Marcus's face flush with humiliation, his protective instincts warring with his obvious desire to disappear. "I'm sorry," Marcus said stiffly, his hand tightening on Lily's shoulder. "We really do need to go." "No," Elena said sharply, the word escaping before she could stop herself. "I mean, that's completely unnecessary. There are several excellent hotels nearby, and I'm sure we could arrange—" "We don't need charity," Marcus cut her off, his voice carrying an edge that made Elena flinch with recognition. It was the same tone he'd used that terrible night 10 years ago when he'd thrown her family's business offer back in her face, the same prideful anger that had destroyed everything beautiful between them. "It wouldn't be charity," Elena insisted, desperate to keep him from walking away again. "It would be hospitality." "You're guests at my wedding," she corrected quickly, glancing at Richard, who was watching this exchange with growing bewilderment. "We're not guests," Marcus replied with devastating clarity. "We're crashers who got caught. And now we're leaving." The honesty of his admission hung in the air like an accusation. Elena felt her cheeks burn as she processed what he was really saying. He'd been so desperate for food that he'd resorted to sneaking into strangers' wedding receptions with his young daughter. The successful, confident woman she'd become recoiled from the implications, while the part of her that had once loved Marcus Chen with consuming passion felt her heart break all over again. "Marcus, wait," she called, as he guided Lily toward the exit, but he didn't turn around. Elena started to follow them, her wedding dress rustling with each urgent step, but Richard's hand on her arm stopped her progress. "Elena, darling, what's going on?" her husband asked, his voice carrying the first hint of concern she'd heard from him all evening. "Who was that man really, and why did he seem so familiar with you?" The question she'd been dreading for 3 years of engagement suddenly demanded answers she wasn't prepared to give. How could she explain Marcus to Richard without revealing the depth of connection they'd shared? How could she make her perfectly appropriate husband understand that she'd once loved someone with the kind of consuming passion that made everything else feel like pale imitation? "He was important to me once," Elena said carefully, her eyes still tracking Marcus's retreat across the reception hall. "A long time ago." "Important how?" Richard's voice carried the kind of analytical precision that had made him successful in business negotiations. He was assembling information, looking for patterns and motivations that would help him understand the threat Marcus represented. Elena forced herself to focus on Richard's concerned face, to remember that she was wearing his ring and had just vowed to build a life with him. "We dated in college. It ended badly. I haven't seen him since graduation." The oversimplification felt like betraying everything she and Marcus had shared, but how could she explain the reality? That Marcus had been the love of her life, the person who'd understood her dreams and ambitions better than anyone before or since? That she'd measured every relationship against the memory of what they'd built together and found them all lacking? And he just happened to show up at our wedding? Richard's lawyer instincts were clearly activated. "That seems like quite a coincidence." "He wasn't invited," Elena admitted, watching Marcus and Lily disappear through the exit doors. "I think they were. I think they needed food and saw an opportunity." Richard's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, confusion, and what might have been pity. "He brought his daughter to crash our wedding reception because they were hungry?" The stark way Richard phrased it made Elena flinch. "He struggled financially. His situation is complicated." "Elena, sweetheart, you're shaking." Richard's concern was genuine, his business instincts temporarily set aside in favor of husbandly protectiveness. "This has obviously upset you. Should we ask security to—" "No," Elena said quickly. "No, they're leaving. It's fine." But it wasn't fine. Nothing about seeing Marcus again was fine. The careful emotional equilibrium she'd maintained for 10 years had been shattered by 10 minutes of conversation, and Elena felt as though she was drowning in the flood of memories and regrets that his presence had unleashed. "Mrs. Thornton?" The wedding coordinator appeared at Elena's elbow with practiced discretion. The photographer is ready for the cake-cutting ceremony, and your parents are asking about the first dance. The evening's schedule beckoned, demanding Elena's attention and performance. She was expected to smile, to pose, to play the role of radiant bride, celebrating the happiest day of her life. But her eyes kept drifting toward the exit doors, wondering where Marcus and Lily had gone and whether they had anywhere safe to sleep. "Of course," Elena replied automatically. "We'll be right there." The next hour passed in a blur of camera flashes and congratulations. Elena moved through the motions of her wedding reception with mechanical precision-cutting cake, sharing the first dance with Richard, accepting well wishes from guests who had no idea that her world had tilted off its axis. She smiled and laughed and played the part of perfect bride while her mind remained fixed on Marcus's face when Lily had innocently revealed their financial desperation. During the father-daughter dance with Roberto, Elena caught sight of her reflection in the ballroom's mirrored walls. She looked exactly as she'd imagined on her wedding day, elegant, sophisticated, surrounded by the kind of celebration that magazines featured in their society pages. But the woman in the mirror felt like a stranger wearing Elena's face. "You seem distracted, mija," Roberto said gently, as they swayed to the string quartet's rendition of "The Way You Look Tonight." "Is everything all right?" Elena met her father's concerned gaze, remembering the conversation they'd had when she'd first brought Richard home to meet her parents. Roberto had expressed satisfaction that Elena had finally chosen someone suitable, someone who understood the importance of family reputation and social position. He'd never said Marcus's name, but Elena had understood that Richard represented everything Marcus hadn't: security, appropriateness, the promise of a future, free from the complications that passionate love created. "I'm fine, Papa," she lied smoothly. "Just overwhelmed by everything. It's been a long day." Roberto's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced, but he didn't push. The dance ended with applause, and Elena was immediately swept into another round of photographs and social obligations. It wasn't until nearly midnight, after the last guest had departed and the cleanup crew was dismantling the elaborate decorations, that Elena finally had a moment alone. She stood in the hotel's empty ballroom, her wedding dress pooling around her feet, staring at the cocktail table where Marcus and Lily had sat. The elegant reception space looked different without the warm glow of celebration, stark, almost cold in its emptiness. Elena tried to reconcile the image of Marcus desperately feeding his daughter at this very table with her memories of the confident, talented young man who'd once sketched designs for their imaginary business, while she planned marketing strategies that would have changed the world. "There you are." Richard appeared in the doorway, having changed from his tuxedo into more comfortable clothes. "Ready to head up to the suite? The car for the airport leaves at 8. Their honeymoon itinerary was perfect: 2 weeks in Italy, visiting art museums and vineyards, staying in hotels that Richard had researched meticulously to ensure they represented the pinnacle of luxury and cultural significance. Elena had been looking forward to it for months, imagining romantic dinners and explorations of cities she'd dreamed of visiting since college. Now, the prospect felt exhausting. "Richard," she said carefully, "what if we postpone the honeymoon for a few days? I know we have reservations, but—" "Postpone?" Richard's surprise was evident. "Elena, we've been planning this trip for 8 months. The hotels are booked, the flights are confirmed. Why would we want to postpone?" How could she explain that she needed time to process Marcus's reappearance, to understand what his presence meant for the life she'd just committed to building with Richard? How could she make her new husband understand that seeing the man she'd once loved reduced to crashing weddings for food had left her questioning everything she thought she knew about her own choices? "I'm just tired," she said weakly. "It's been an emotional day." Richard crossed the empty ballroom and wrapped his arms around her, his embrace warm and reassuring, in ways that should have felt comforting. "Of course you're tired. It's been a perfect but exhausting celebration. But think how relaxing it will be to wake up in Florence tomorrow afternoon with nothing to do but enjoy each other's company and explore one of the most beautiful cities in the world." His enthusiasm was infectious, and Elena tried to summon matching excitement for their planned adventures. Richard had worked hard to create the perfect honeymoon experience, just as he'd worked hard to create the perfect wedding celebration. He deserved a wife who could appreciate his efforts instead of dwelling on the ghost of a relationship that had ended a decade ago. "You're right," Elena said, forcing a smile. "Florence will be wonderful." But as they left the empty ballroom and headed toward the elevator that would take them to their honeymoon suite, Elena found herself wondering what Marcus and Lily were doing at that moment. Were they driving through the night back to Portland, sleeping in his car because they couldn't afford a hotel room? Had Lily asked her father why the pretty bride lady had seemed so sad when they left? The elevator doors closed with a soft chime, carrying Elena toward her new life as Mrs. Richard Thornton. But part of her remained in that ballroom, at a cocktail table where the man she'd never stopped loving had sat with his daughter, desperate enough to crash a stranger's wedding just to feed his child. 3 floors above the empty reception hall, Elena Rodriguez Thornton lay awake in Egyptian cotton sheets, staring at the ceiling while her husband slept peacefully beside her. Outside their windows, Seattle glittered with the same lights that had once illuminated late-night conversations with Marcus about dreams they'd planned to build together. She thought about the moment when Marcus had recognized Hertha shock in his eyes, giving way to something that might have been regret. She thought about his careful politeness, the way he'd introduced her to Lily as though she were a stranger instead of someone who'd once known every thought in his head. Most painfully, she thought about his pride, still intact after all these years, still powerful enough to make him refuse help even when his daughter's well-being was at stake. Dawn was breaking over Elliott Bay when Elena finally admitted what she'd been avoiding all night. Seeing Marcus again had reminded her of who she used to be before she'd learned to want safe things, before she'd chosen security over passion, before she'd convinced herself that Richard's steady affection was preferable to the complicated intensity she'd shared with the boy from Tacoma who'd loved her despite believing he wasn't good enough for her. World. Her phone buzzed with a text from their travel coordinator confirming their morning departure time. In 6 hours, she would be on a plane to Italy with her new husband, beginning the honeymoon that was supposed to mark the start of their perfect life together. But Elena Rodriguez Thornton, who had built an empire on her ability to create meaningful celebrations for others, couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to embark on the longest performance of her life, pretending that settling for appropriate love was the same thing as finding true love, pretending that Marcus Chen hadn't walked into her wedding reception and reminded her of everything she'd given up in the name of making sensible choices. The morning sun streamed through their hotel suite windows, painting Seattle in shades of gold and possibility. Somewhere in that awakening city, Marcus was probably helping Lily get ready for their drive back to Portland, back to their real life of financial struggle and single parenthood, and the quiet dignity of making something meaningful from limited resources. Elena closed her eyes and tried to imagine herself in Florence, walking hand in hand with Richard through ancient streets while Marcus and Lily faced another day of uncertainty 3,000 miles away. The image should have filled her with anticipation for the luxury and romance awaiting her. Instead, it felt like the first step toward a lifetime of wondering what might have been if she'd been brave enough to follow her heart instead of her parents' expectations, if she'd been willing to fight for complicated love instead of accepting comfortable compromise. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hotel suite's marble floor as Elena stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, still wearing the silk nightgown from her wedding night. Below, Seattle was awakening with the bustling energy of a Saturday morning. Joggers traced paths along the waterfront, coffee shops prepared for weekend crowds, and families began their days with the comfortable routines that Elena had once imagined building with someone who understood her completely. "The car will be here in 30 minutes, Richard announced from the bedroom, his voice carrying the efficient satisfaction of someone whose plans were proceeding exactly as scheduled. "I've confirmed our check-in at the Florence Hotel, and the concierge has arranged a private tour of the Uffizi for tomorrow afternoon." Elena nodded automatically, though her reflection in the window showed a woman whose mind was clearly elsewhere. She'd been standing in the same spot for 20 minutes, watching the city come alive while her thoughts remained fixed on Marcus and Lily Chen, wondering where they'd spent the night and whether they were already on the road back to Portland. "Elena?" Richard appeared in the doorway, concern evident in his voice. "You haven't started packing. Is everything all right?" She turned to face her husband of less than 12 hours, studying his earnest expression and feeling the weight of expectations that had shaped both their lives. Richard Thornton was everything her parents had hoped she'd find: stable, successful, appropriate. He would never crash a wedding reception out of desperation, never struggle to afford basic necessities, never force her to choose between love and security. He was also someone she'd settled for, rather than chosen with her whole heart. "Richard," Elena said carefully, "what if we delayed the honeymoon by one day? I know it sounds strange, but there's something I need to take care of first." Richard's eyebrows rose with the kind of polite confusion that characterized his response to anything that deviated from established plans. "Something you need to take care of?" "Darling, we've been planning this trip for months. The hotels are expecting us. The tours are booked. What could possibly be more important than our honeymoon?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Elena wasn't ready to articulate. How could she explain that seeing Marcus again had reminded her of who she used to be before she'd learned to prioritize practical considerations over passionate impulses? How could she make Richard understand that their perfectly planned honeymoon felt like a beautiful cage compared to the messy authenticity of the life Marcus was building with his daughter? "It's complicated," Elena said weakly, knowing the response was inadequate but unable to find words that would bridge the gulf between what Richard expected and what she was actually feeling. "Elena, you're scaring me." Richard crossed the room with the determined stride that had made him successful in business negotiations. "Last night you were distracted. This morning you want to change our travel plans. What's really going on?" The directness of his question demanded honesty that Elena wasn't sure she was brave enough to provide. But, looking at Richard's concerned face, she realized that he deserved better than a wife who was already keeping secrets 12 hours into their marriage. "The man from last night," she began slowly. "Marcus Chen. We weren't just college classmates." Richard's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, his lawyer instincts engaging as he processed this new information. "How not just classmates? We were together for almost a year. We were very serious. We talked about marriage, about building a business together, about creating something meaningful." The words felt rusty, as though she hadn't spoken them aloud in years. "My parents offered to invest in our future, and Marcus turned them down. He ended our relationship because he thought I was too good for him, because he couldn't accept help from my family." The silence that followed was deafening. Elena watched Richard's face as he absorbed this revelation, seeing him recalibrate everything he thought he knew about her past and their present. "And last night was the first time you'd seen him since college?" Richard asked finally, his tone carefully neutral. "Yes. I had no idea he would be there. I don't think he knew it was my wedding. He and his daughter were there because they needed food. The admission felt like confessing a crime." "Richard, they were hungry. Desperate enough to crash a stranger's wedding just to eat." Richard ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, disrupting his morning grooming routine for the first time since Elena had known him. "And this bothers you?" "Of course it bothers me," Elena replied, surprised by the vehemence in her own voice. "The man I once loved is struggling to feed his child, while I'm spending more on flowers for one evening than most people make in a month. How could that not bother me?" "Because it's not your responsibility," Richard said, with the kind of logical clarity that had initially attracted Elena to him. "Elena, people make choices. This Marcus made his choice when he walked away from you and your family's support. You can't save everyone from the consequences of their own pride." The response was perfectly reasonable and completely wrong. Elena stared at her husband, recognizing the fundamental difference in how they approached the world. Richard saw Marcus's struggles as the inevitable result of poor decision-making, a cautionary tale about the importance of accepting advantageous opportunities. Elena saw a brilliant man whose pride had led him to reject help, whose love had been strong enough to sacrifice his own happiness for what he believed was her best interest. "I need to find him," Elena said suddenly, the decision crystallizing as she spoke. "I need to understand what happened to him, how he ended up in this situation." "Elena, we're leaving for our honeymoon in 20 minutes," Richard said, his voice carrying the first hint of irritation she'd heard from him. "Whatever closure you think you need with this man can wait until we return." "No," Elena replied, surprising herself with the firmness of her response. "It can't wait. Richard, I've spent 10 years wondering what happened to Marcus, and now I know he's been struggling while I've been building the life I thought I wanted. I can't get on a plane to Italy and pretend that seeing him again didn't change everything." The words escaped before Elena could censor them, revealing more than she'd intended about the state of her heart and her marriage. Richard's expression shifted from irritation to something approaching alarm as he processed what she was really saying. "Changed everything? How?" he asked quietly. Elena met his gaze, seeing the good man she'd married and feeling the weight of the hurt she was about to inflict. "I don't know yet, but I need to find out." 2 hours later, Elena stood outside a modest apartment building in South Seattle. Having tracked down Marcus's location through a combination of social media detective work and calls to mutual college acquaintances who'd maintained loose contact over the years. Her wedding dress had been replaced by jeans and a sweater. Her elaborate hair and makeup traded for the simple ponytail and minimal cosmetics that felt more authentic to who she used to be. The building was exactly what she'd expected: clean, but aging, the kind of housing that working families could afford if they were careful with their budgets. Children's bikes were chained to the front porch, and window boxes contained the brave flowers that people planted when they were determined to create beauty despite economic limitations. Elena climbed the stairs to apartment 2B with trembling hands, each step feeling like a journey backward through time. She'd rehearsed this conversation during the drive from her hotel, imagining various scenarios and responses. But now that she stood before Marcus's door, all her planned words evaporated. The sound of laughter from inside the apartment stopped her from knocking immediately. Through the thin walls, she could hear Lily's voice raised in excitement, followed by Marcus's deeper tones and what sounded like a game involving considerable movement around the small space. "Marco," Lily called out. "Polo," Marcus responded, his voice muffled as though he was hiding behind furniture. The simple joy in their interaction made Elena's chest tighten with emotion. Despite their financial struggles, despite the obvious challenges of single parenthood, Marcus had created a home filled with love and laughter for his daughter. The realization highlighted everything that was missing from Elena's own perfectly appointed life. She knocked softly, not wanting to interrupt their game, but knowing that standing in the hallway indefinitely wasn't sustainable. The sounds inside ceased immediately, followed by footsteps approaching the door. "Who is it?" Marcus's voice carried the cautious tone of someone who'd learned to be wary of unexpected visitors. "It's Elena," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Elena wondered if Marcus was going to pretend he hadn't heard her. When the door finally opened, he stood in the doorway wearing jeans and a t-shirt that had seen better days, his hair disheveled from whatever game he'd been playing with Lily. "Elena," he said, her name carrying a complex mixture of surprise, wariness, and something that might have been longing. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you," she replied honestly. "To talk to you properly, without wedding guests and photographers and all the performance that last night required." Marcus glanced back into the apartment, clearly torn between his desire to maintain the boundaries that had protected him for 10 years and his curiosity about why Elena had sought him out. "Shouldn't you be on your honeymoon?" "Probably," Elena admitted. "But I couldn't leave without understanding what happened to you, to us, to the dreams we used to share." Before Marcus could respond, Lily appeared at his side, peering around her father with the unabashed curiosity of childhood. She'd changed from her formal dress into play clothes leggings with a small hole in one knee and a t-shirt advertising a local community center. "Hi, pretty lady from the wedding," Lily said brightly. "Did you come to play Marco Polo with us? Daddy's really bad at hiding because he's too tall for our furniture." Elena felt her heart constrict at the child's innocent welcome. "Hello, Lily. I'm not sure about Marco Polo, but I was hoping to talk to your father for a few minutes." Marcus looked between Elena and his daughter, clearly calculating the wisdom of allowing Elena into their private space. Finally, he stepped aside with visible reluctance. 5 minutes, he said quietly. "And then you go back to your husband and your new life." The apartment was exactly what Elena had expected: small, clean, and furnished with items that prioritized function over aesthetics. But it was also filled with evidence of the life Marcus had built with Lily, her artwork covering one wall, photos of their adventures to local parks and free museums, books stacked on every available surface. "Can I get you something to drink?" Marcus asked with automatic politeness, though his posture remained guarded. "Coffee? Water?" "Coffee would be nice," Elena replied, grateful for an activity that might ease the tension crackling between them. As Marcus moved around the small kitchen, Elena studied the space that had become his world. The refrigerator was covered with Lily's school papers and art projects, each one displayed with the pride of a parent who celebrated every achievement. A small desk in the corner held what appeared to be design work logos and brochures for local businesses that couldn't afford professional marketing services. "You kept designing," Elena observed, moving closer to examine his recent work. "Community health centers, small nonprofits, the occasional restaurant that's willing to pay in actual money instead of exposure," Marcus replied, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and resignation. "It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills, usually." The qualifier hung in the air between them, acknowledging the financial struggles that had led them to crash her wedding reception. Elena picked up a brochure for a prenatal care clinic, studying the clean lines and accessible typography that made complex medical information understandable for people who might not have health insurance or college educations. "This is beautiful work," she said honestly. "You found a way to use design to actually help people instead of just selling them things they don't need." Marcus paused in his coffee preparation, glancing at her with surprise. "That's not what your family thought 10 years ago. Lacking commercial viability was how your father phrased it." The bitterness in his voice was still fresh after all these years, and Elena felt guilt wash over her as she remembered her parents' dismissive comments about Marcus's idealism. They'd seen his commitment to meaningful work as evidence of his unsuitability rather than recognition of his character. "My family was wrong about a lot of things," Elena said quietly. "Were they?" Marcus asked, turning to face her fully. "Elena, look around. This is what choosing idealism over pragmatism gets you. I turned down your father's business proposal because I was too proud to accept help, too stubborn to compromise my vision. 10 years later, I'm a single father struggling to pay rent while you're building an empire and marrying into one of the most prominent families in the Pacific Northwest." The self-recrimination in his voice made Elena want to close the distance between them and remind him of everything beautiful and worthy about the choices he'd made. Instead, she remained where she was, recognizing that Marcus needed to say these things that had obviously been weighing on him for years. "Tell me what happened," she said simply. "After college, after you left Seattle. Tell me about Lily's mother, about how you ended up here." Marcus handed her a mug of coffee black, because he probably couldn't afford cream or sugar, and settled into the chair across from her with the careful distance of someone who'd learned not to trust his own emotional responses. "I went to Portland like I planned," he began, his voice taking on the flat tone of someone recounting facts rather than feelings. "Got the job at Morrison Agency, found an apartment, convinced myself I was building something meaningful. For a while, it worked. I was good at what I did. The clients appreciated my understanding of their communities, and I told myself I'd made the right choice." Elena sipped her coffee and waited, recognizing that Marcus needed to tell this story at his own pace. "I met Melissa during my second year there," he continued. "She was a photographer, younger than me, full of energy and optimism about the future. She didn't know anything about you, about the life I'd left behind in Seattle. With her, I could pretend to be someone who'd never had his heart broken, someone who was capable of moving forward instead of always looking backward." The admission hit Elena like a physical blow. While she'd been building her business and trying to convince herself that Richard represented a mature choice, Marcus had been attempting to create a new identity that didn't include the pain of their lost love. "When Melissa got pregnant, it felt like a sign," Marcus said, his gaze shifting to where Lily was coloring at the small dining table, earbuds in as she listened to music on an old tablet. "A chance to build the family I'd always wanted, to prove that I could create something lasting and meaningful despite my mistakes with you." "And, Melissa?" Elena asked gently. Marcus's expression tightened with old pain. Motherhood wasn't what she'd expected. She loved Lily, but she felt trapped by the responsibilities, by the way having a child limited her freedom and artistic pursuits. We tried to make it work, but eventually she decided that staying meant giving up too much of herself. Elena watched Lily coloring with intense concentration, her small face serious as she selected different crayons for what appeared to be a family portrait. "How long has it been, just the two of you?" 6 years, Marcus replied. "Melissa sends birthday cards sometimes, Christmas presents when she remembers. She's building the life she wanted, traveling for photography assignments, free from the complications that children create." The matter-of-fact way Marcus described his abandonment by another woman made Elena's heart ache for him. First, she had left him when he'd pushed her away with his pride. Then Melissa had left him when motherhood proved more demanding than expected. He'd been building his life around people who ultimately chose other paths. "Daddy," Lily called from the table, "can Elena see my picture?" Before Marcus could respond, Lily had bounced over to them with the boundless energy of childhood, holding up her artwork for Elena's inspection. The drawing showed 3 figures standing in front of what appeared to be a house, a tall man with dark hair, a smaller figure with pigtails who was obviously Lily herself, and a woman with long dark hair who bore a striking resemblance to Elena. "That's beautiful," Elena said, though her voice was slightly unsteady. "Who are these people?" "That's me and Daddy," Lily explained matter-of-factly, pointing to each figure. "And that's the pretty lady who was nice to us at the wedding. I drew her because she looked sad when we had to leave, and I thought maybe she needed a family picture to make her feel better." The innocent observation hit Elena with devastating accuracy. Lily had seen something in Elena's expression that the adults had missed or chosen to ignore: the sadness of someone watching love walk away again, the recognition of loss that transcended the celebration surrounding them. "Why did you think I looked sad?" Elena asked, kneeling down to Lily's eye level. Lily considered the question with the seriousness that children brought to emotional observations. "Because your eyes look like Daddy's do sometimes when he thinks I'm not watching. Like you're missing something important, but you don't know how to get it back." The accuracy of Lily's assessment made Elena's chest tighten with emotion. Out of the mouths of babes, she thought, remembering how children often saw truths that adults worked hard to hide from themselves. "Lily makes me sound like a sad sack," Marcus said with forced lightness, clearly uncomfortable with his daughter's perceptive observations. "I'm perfectly happy with our life here." But Elena caught the look that passed between father and daughter. Lily's expression, suggesting she knew better than to believe her father's claim of contentment, Marcus's slight flush indicating he'd been caught in a protective lie. "Are you happy?" Elena asked Marcus directly, her question cutting through the polite deflection to the heart of what she needed to understand. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Elena and Lily as he weighed his response. Finally, he met Elena's eyes, with the kind of unflinching honesty that had always characterized their most important conversations. "I'm grateful," he said carefully. "I have Lily, I have work that matters, I have enough to get by most months. That's more than a lot of people have." "That's not what I asked," Elena pressed gently. Marcus's composure cracked slightly, revealing the vulnerability he'd been working to conceal. "No," he admitted quietly, "I'm not happy. I haven't been happy since the night I let pride matter more than love, since I convinced myself that walking away from you was somehow noble instead of just cowardly." The confession hung in the air between them, 10 years of regret and longing finally given voice. Elena felt tears prick at her eyes as she processed the weight of Marcus's admission and its implications for both their lives. "I never stopped loving you," Marcus continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every relationship since then has been an attempt to recreate what we had, and every failure has reminded me that some connections can't be replicated or replaced." Elena reached across the small space between them, her hand covering his with the same electric connection that had characterized their first touch 10 years earlier. "Marcus, I need you to know that marrying Richard was the biggest mistake of my life. I convinced myself that choosing security over passion was mature, that building an appropriate life was more important than building an authentic one. Elena, Marcus started, but she cut him off. I spent our entire engagement wondering why I felt like I was preparing for someone else's life, she continued, the words pouring out now that she'd found the courage to speak them. Last night, when I saw you with Lily, when I realized how much you'd sacrificed and struggled while I've been playing it safe, I understood what I've been running from all these years. Lily looked up from her coloring, sensing the emotional intensity of the adult conversation even if she didn't understand its full implications. Are you going to be friends with Daddy now? She asked Elena with the directness that only children could manage. Elena looked at Marcus, seeing in his eyes the same longing and possibility that she felt stirring in her own heart. The safe life she'd built with Richard beckoned from 20 miles away, where her new husband was probably wondering why his wife had disappeared on their wedding morning. But in this small apartment, surrounded by evidence of the meaningful life Marcus had built despite every obstacle, Elena finally understood what she'd been searching for without knowing it. The courage to choose love over logic, authenticity over appropriateness, the messy beauty of real connection over the polished perfection of suitable arrangements. I don't know what happens next, Elena said honestly, her gaze moving between Marcus and Lily. But I know I can't pretend anymore that the life I've built is the life I actually want. Outside the apartment windows, Seattle hummed with the energy of a city where anything was possible for those brave enough to reach for it. Inside, 3 people who had found each other across years of separation and heartbreak began to imagine what it might look like to choose love over fear, to trust that sometimes the best decisions were the ones that made no practical sense but felt like coming home. The afternoon sun slanted through the apartment windows as Elena sat across from Marcus, both of them processing the weight of confessions that had taken 10 years to voice. Lily continued coloring at the dining table, her presence a gentle reminder that any decisions they made would affect more than just the 2 adults who had found their way back to each other through a combination of desperation and fate. Elena's phone buzzed insistently from her purse, the sound cutting through the charged silence that had settled between them. She ignored it, but the buzzing continued with the relentless rhythm of someone who expected immediate responses. You should answer that, Marcus said quietly, his practical nature asserting itself despite the emotional vulnerability of the moment. Your husband is probably worried. The word husband hit Elena like cold water, forcing her to confront the reality of her situation. 12 hours ago, she had pledged to love, honor, and cherish Richard Thornton for the rest of her life. Now she sat in another man's apartment, holding his hand and contemplating abandoning everything she'd built for the possibility of reclaiming a love she'd thought was lost forever. Richard, she answered on the 7th ring, her voice carefully controlled. Elena, thank God. Richard's relief was palpable through the phone. Where are you? The car has been waiting for over an hour, and if we don't leave soon, we'll miss our connection in New York. Elena closed her eyes, picturing Richard standing in their hotel suite, surrounded by perfectly packed luggage, his schedule disrupted by his wife's inexplicable disappearance on what should have been the most predictable day of their marriage. I'm not coming, Elena said, the words escaping before she could second-guess them. Richard, I can't get on that plane. I can't pretend that everything is normal when nothing feels right. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena could hear Richard processing this information, his lawyer's mind working to understand implications and motivations. This is about him, isn't it? Richard said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. The man from last night, Marcus. It's about me, Elena replied, though she knew the distinction was meaningless from Richard's perspective. It's about realizing that I married you for all the wrong reasons, that I've been trying to convince myself that appropriate love is the same as true love. Elena, you're having some kind of emotional breakdown, Richard said, his tone shifting to the careful patience he used with unstable clients. This is classic wedding day stress, amplified by seeing an old boyfriend. We can work through this. Come back to the hotel, and we'll talk it through with a counselor when we return from Italy." The response was so perfectly Richard rational, solution-oriented, treating her emotional crisis as a problem to be managed rather than a revelation to be honored. Elena felt the final threads of her commitment to their marriage snap as she recognized how fundamentally they misunderstood each other. "Richard, I'm not having a breakdown," she said firmly. "I'm having a breakthrough. For the first time in years, I'm being honest about what I actually want instead of what I think I should want. And what you want is to throw away our marriage, our future, everything we've built together for a man who crashed our wedding because he was too proud to ask for help." Richard's composure was beginning to crack, revealing the hurt and confusion beneath his practiced control. Elena glanced at Marcus, who was studying his coffee mug with the careful attention of someone trying not to eavesdrop on a conversation that directly concerned him. Lily continued coloring, her earbuds providing merciful insulation from the adult drama unfolding around her. "I want authenticity," Elena said quietly. "I want to wake up excited about my life, instead of checking off boxes on someone else's definition of success. I want to love someone who sees all of me, not just the parts that fit into predetermined categories." "And you think this Marcus can give you that?" Richard asked, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and disdain. "Elena, look at his situation. Look at where choosing idealism over practicality has gotten him. Is that really the life you want?" The question crystallized everything Elena had been struggling to articulate. Richard saw Marcus's circumstances as evidence of failure, proof that choosing passion over security led inevitably to struggle and disappointment. But Elena saw something different. A man who had built a meaningful life from limited resources, who had raised a remarkable daughter while maintaining his integrity and commitment to work that mattered. "Yes," Elena said without hesitation, "I'd rather struggle with someone I love completely than coast comfortably with someone I care about but don't truly connect with." The honesty of her response seemed to shock Richard into silence. When he spoke again, his voice carried the flat tone of someone processing devastating news. "I see," he said simply. "And there's nothing I can say to change your mind? No compromise we can reach?" Elena felt tears prick at her eyes as she heard the genuine hurt in Richard's voice. He was a good man who deserved better than a wife who had settled for him, who had convinced herself that his steadiness was enough to build a lifetime on. "Richard, you deserve someone who chooses you with her whole heart," Elena said gently. "Someone who doesn't have to convince herself that what you offer is enough. I'm not that person, and pretending otherwise isn't fair to either of us." The conversation that followed was painful but necessary. Discussions of annulment procedures, division of wedding gifts, explanations that would need to be given to family and friends. Richard maintained his professional composure throughout, treating the dissolution of their marriage like a complex business negotiation that required careful attention to detail. "I'll handle the legal aspects," he said finally. "And I'll take care of explaining the situation to our families. What will you tell people when they ask what happened?" Elena looked around Marcus's modest apartment, taking in the evidence of a life built on love rather than logic, on authentic choices rather than appropriate ones. "That I finally found the courage to choose what I actually wanted instead of what I thought I should want," she replied. After ending the call, Elena sat in the silence that filled Marcus's living room, processing the magnitude of what she'd just done. In the span of a single phone conversation, she'd ended her marriage, abandoned her honeymoon, and dismantled the carefully constructed life that had taken her 3 years to build. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked gently, his voice carrying concern rather than triumph. "I'm terrified," Elena admitted. "I just blew up my entire life based on 20 minutes of conversation and 10-year-old feelings that might not translate into present-day reality." Marcus reached across the small space between them, taking her hand with the same careful reverence he'd shown when they were 22, and discovering love for the first time. "Elena, I need you to understand something," he said seriously. "I can't give you the life Richard could have provided. I can't offer you security or social status or the kind of comfortable future your parents always wanted for you. Most months, I'm not even sure I can afford groceries for both Lily and me." "I know," Elena replied, squeezing his hand. And that doesn't scare me the way it should, which probably says something important about what I actually value. It should scare you, Marcus insisted. Elena, you're used to a world where money isn't a constant concern, where opportunities and connections and safety nets exist automatically. I'm offering you a life where we'll have to fight for everything, where success isn't guaranteed and failure is always possible. Elena studied Marcus's face, seeing the vulnerability beneath his practical warnings. He was trying to protect her from making an impulsive decision that she might regret, trying to ensure that her choice was based on reality rather than romantic nostalgia. "Marcus," she said quietly, "do you remember what we used to talk about in college? How we wanted to build something meaningful together, something that would make a difference in people's lives?" "I remember," Marcus replied, his voice soft with memory. "I've spent 10 years building exactly the kind of successful business we dreamed about," Elena continued. "I plan events for wealthy people who spend more on flowers than most families make in a year. I create beautiful celebrations for people who have everything except authentic connection to their communities or purpose beyond displaying their own success." She paused, gathering courage for what she needed to say next. "But yesterday, watching you with Lily, seeing the work you've created, understanding how you've built a life focused on helping people rather than impressing them that felt more like the future we imagined than anything I've accomplished in my supposedly successful career." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing Elena's words while studying her face for signs of romantic delusion versus genuine understanding. "What are you saying?" he asked finally. "I'm saying that I want to combine what I've learned with what you've built," Elena replied, her voice growing stronger as the idea crystallized. "I have resources, connections, business experience that could help expand the kind of work you're already doing. You have authenticity, community relationships, and an understanding of what people actually need rather than what they think they want." "Elena," Marcus started, but she continued before he could voice the objections she could see forming. "I'm not talking about charity or rescue or any of the dynamics that destroyed us before," she said firmly. "I'm talking about partnership between equals who have different strengths and shared values. I'm talking about building the business we dreamed about when we were too young to understand how complicated real life could be." Lily looked up from her coloring, sensing the shift in energy around the adult conversation. "Are you going to be my new mom?" she asked Elena with the direct approach that only children could manage. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that none of them were quite ready to address. Elena looked at Lily, this remarkable little girl, who had been raised by a single father, struggling against impossible odds, who had learned to find joy despite financial limitations, who possessed the kind of emotional intelligence that suggested she'd been taught to value character over circumstances. "I don't know what happens next," Elena said honestly, "but I'd like to be part of your and your father's lives if you'd both like that." Lily considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important decisions. "Do you know how to make pancakes?" she asked finally. Elena laughed, the first genuine laughter she'd experienced in months. "I make terrible pancakes, but I'm excellent at finding restaurants that make great ones." "That works," Lily decided pragmatically. "Daddy burns everything anyway." "I do not burn everything," Marcus protested with mock indignation. "I burn most things. There's an important distinction." The easy banter felt like coming home, like stepping back into a dynamic that had been interrupted rather than ended. Elena felt something loosen in her chest as she recognized the possibility of building something real and lasting with people who valued her for who she was rather than what she represented. Over the following weeks, Elena's decision created exactly the kind of scandal she'd expected. Her parents were devastated. Her social circle was agog with gossip, and the Seattle society pages had a field day with the story of the bride who'd abandoned her honeymoon to pursue her college sweetheart. Roberto Rodriguez requested a meeting that felt more like a tribunal, gathering in the conference room of his flagship restaurant to deliver the kind of disappointed lecture that Elena had been dreading since childhood. "You had everything," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Security, status, A future free from financial worry. And you threw it away for what? A man who couldn't afford to feed his own child? I threw it away for authenticity, Elena replied, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of disappointing the parents who had sacrificed so much for her opportunities. For the chance to build something meaningful instead of something merely impressive. Carmen Rodriguez dabbed at her eyes with a linen handkerchief, her composure cracking as she processed her daughter's choices. Elena, we worked so hard to give you options, to ensure you'd never have to struggle the way we did when we were starting out. Why would you choose hardship when you could have comfort? The question revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had shaped Elena's entire approach to relationships and career choices. Her parents saw Marcus's financial struggles as evidence of failure rather than recognition of his commitment to meaningful work over lucrative compromise. Because comfort without purpose feels like a beautiful prison, Elena said gently, and I'd rather struggle towards something I believe in than coast towards something that looks impressive but feels empty. The conversation ended without resolution, though Elena hoped that time might help her parents understand her choice, even if they couldn't support it. Richard, to his credit, handled the annulment proceedings with grace and efficiency, publicly citing irreconcilable differences, while privately expressing hope that Elena would find whatever happiness she was seeking. Meanwhile, Elena began the practical work of rebuilding her life around different priorities. She dissolved Rodriguez events, marketing, returning deposits to clients, and referring them to competitors who could provide the kind of luxury celebrations she no longer felt called to create. Instead, she began exploring how her event planning skills might serve community organizations, nonprofits, and the kind of locally owned businesses that formed the backbone of neighborhoods, like the one where Marcus and Lily lived. What if we created celebrations that actually brought communities together instead of just displaying wealth? Elena asked Marcus one evening as they planned what would become their first collaborative Projecta fundraising gala for the community health center where he designed marketing materials. You mean events where the purpose is connection rather than competition? Marcus replied, his eyes lighting up with the kind of enthusiasm Elena remembered from their college planning sessions. Exactly. Events that are beautiful but accessible, celebrations that honor what people value rather than what they own. The fundraising gala exceeded all expectations, raising more money for the health center than their previous 3 fundraisers combined, while creating the kind of warm, inclusive atmosphere that made every attendee feel valued rather than evaluated. You two work well together, observed Dr. Sevent. Patricia Chen, the health center's director, as she surveyed the success of their collaboration. Have you considered making this kind of partnership permanent? Elena and Marcus exchanged glances across the room, recognizing the question they'd been dancing around for months. Their professional collaboration had been seamless. Their personal relationship had deepened into something stronger than their college romance. And Lily had embraced Elena's presence in their lives with the generous heart of a child who understood love as expansion rather than competition. But the ghost of their previous failure still haunted both of them, creating hesitation about formalizing commitments that had ended so painfully before. 6 months after Elena's wedding day decision, they were planning their 3rd collaborative event when Lily made the announcement that forced them to address their careful avoidance of the future. I told my teacher that Elena is my bonus mom, she announced over dinner in the larger apartment they'd moved to when Elena's presence became permanent. She said that was a nice way to think about it. Elena felt her heart skip as she processed Lily's casual redefinition of their family structure. Bonus mom? Because I already had one mom who left, and now I have you who stayed. Lily explained with the logical clarity that characterized her approach to emotional complexities. So you're like a bonus, except better because you actually want to be here. Marcus set down his fork, his expression serious as he looked at Elena. Is that what you want? To be here permanently, to be part of this family we're building? The question demanded the kind of honesty that Elena had spent months building toward. Yes, she said without hesitation. I want to wake up in this apartment with both of you. I want to plan events that matter with a partner who understands me completely. I want to help Lily with homework and attend school plays and argue about bedtimes. Even when money is tight and the work is hard and we can't afford the kind of vacations your old social circle takes for granted? Marcus pressed, still protective of them all against the possibility of future regret. Especially then, Elena replied firmly. Marcus, I spent years living comfortably while feeling empty. I'd rather struggle with purpose than coast without meaning. The conversation that followed stretched late into the evening, touching on practical concerns about money and housing and career trajectories, but fundamentally focused on the recognition that they had built something rare and worth protecting. 1 year after Elena's wedding day, they held a small ceremony in the community garden behind Lily's school. The guest list included neighbors, colleagues from their community-focused events business, and a handful of family members who had come to understand Elena's choice, even if they didn't entirely approve of it. Roberto and Carmen Rodriguez attended with the dignified resignation of parents who loved their daughter more than they understood her decisions. Richard Thornton sent a gracious note wishing them happiness, having found his own path toward contentment with someone who appreciated his steady nature without requiring passionate intensity. Elena wore a simple dress from a local designer whose work supported immigrant seamstresses, while Marcus chose a suit from a men's cooperative that provided job training for formerly incarcerated individuals. Lily served as both flower girl and ring bearer, her role in the ceremony acknowledging her central place in the family they had chosen to create together. We're not promising perfection, Elena said during the vows they had written together. We're promising authenticity. We're promising to choose love over fear, meaning over comfort, each other over the easier paths we could take separately. We're promising to build something beautiful from whatever resources we have, Marcus added, to value what we create together over what we could accumulate apart, to measure success by the difference we make rather than the wealth we gather. As they exchanged rings made by a local artist from recycled gold, Elena felt the deep satisfaction of choices made with her whole heart rather than her practical mind. The life she was choosing wouldn't be easy or conventionally successful, but it would be authentically hers. 2 years later, Elena stood in the office space they'd rented for their expanded community events business, watching Marcus teach a design workshop for local small business owners while Lily helped distribute materials with the competent authority of someone who'd been raised to understand that meaningful work required everyone's contribution. Their business, Connection Events, had become exactly what they'd dreamed about in college. A company that created beautiful celebrations while building community connections and supporting local economies. They planned fundraisers for organizations serving under-resourced populations, coordinated festivals that celebrated neighborhood diversity, and designed marketing materials that helped local businesses thrive without compromising their values. The profit margins were smaller than Elena's previous venture, but the satisfaction was immeasurably greater. Every event they planned created ripple effects of connection and support that strengthened the communities they served. "Mom?" Lily called from across the room, the title now used naturally rather than tentatively. "Can you help Mrs. Santos understand the marketing package options? She speaks Spanish better than English." Elena smiled, thinking about the girl who had once asked innocent questions about affordability and now served as a bridge between the business and the Spanish-speaking entrepreneurs they increasingly served. Lily had grown into her role as unofficial translator and cultural liaison, her bilingual skills and natural empathy making her invaluable to their community-focused approach. "Of course," Elena replied, moving to assist while Marcus continued his explanation of logo design principles to a group of business owners whose enthusiasm compensated for their limited budgets. As evening approached and they prepared to close the office, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 years ago, she had been preparing for a honeymoon in Italy with a man she cared about but didn't passionately love. Tonight, she would go home to an apartment she shared with the love of her life and the daughter who had taught her that family was defined by choice rather than biology. "Any regrets?" Marcus asked as they locked up the office, Lily skipping ahead toward the bus stop that would take them back to their neighborhood. Elena considered the question seriously, thinking about the luxurious life she'd abandoned, the social status she'd forfeited, the financial security she'd traded for uncertainty and purpose. "Only one," she said finally. Marcus's expression grew concerned. "What's that?" "That it took me 10 years to find the courage to choose what I actually wanted instead of what I thought I should want," Elena replied, taking his hand as they walked toward their shared future. Behind them, the office windows of Connection Events reflected the early evening light, the simple sign announcing their commitment to building something meaningful rather than merely profitable. Ahead of them, Lily waited at the bus stop with the patient confidence of a child who knew her parents would always find their way back to her. The bus that arrived would take them home to their modest apartment, where they would share a dinner prepared from ingredients chosen for nutrition and affordability rather than exotic appeal. They would help Lily with homework, plan the next day's work, and fall asleep in each other's arms while rain tapped against windows that no longer needed to be pristine to feel like home. It wasn't the life Elena had been raised to want, but it was the life she had chosen with her whole heart. And in the arithmetic of love that she had finally learned to trust, authentic happiness multiplied while comfortable compromise merely divided the soul into acceptable portions. As the bus pulled away from the curb, carrying the Chen Rodriguez family toward their evening routine of homework and shared stories and dreams planned around kitchen tables, Elena understood that she had found something more valuable than security or status. She had found her way back to herself, and to the love that had been waiting patiently for her to be brave enough to claim it.